For the past year, my friend Noah and I have been playing the Create mod, and over the course of hundreds of Minecraft days, machines were built, factories flourished, and space was explored. But hiding in the shadow of progress was an enemy who sought to bring it all down. This is the story of the rise and fall of my industrial paradise in the Modpack, Create Above and Beyond. You want to play mod packs with friends, but you can't seem to find a good server. And the free ones? With the big mod packs these days, free servers are just too laggy. Luckily for you, there's BISECT hosting. They host my server, and with plenty of affordable options, they can host your server too. And the best part is, they support almost every mod pack. Use code Doublesal at checkout for 25% off your first order. BISECT hosting, a great site for great servers. If we were going to go from caveman to capitalist, we needed supplies. Noah feared the consequences of our industrial ambitions, but I was able to change his mind. After that, we got some wood, made some tools, got some stone, and while our task seems simple now, little did we know that things were about to get very complicated. There were quests, there were professions, there was even a marketplace where we could take some of our items and sell them for coins. But we didn't want to get ahead of ourselves. The sun had set, we had no food, so we had to sustain ourselves off of a diet of kelp. And while things seemed grim, we spotted some birds, and we took that as a sign that we would soon be soaring to success. So we thanked the birds for their inspiration by keeping them warm in our mouth. After that, we found the site of what would soon be our home. Now, this next house, it wasn't going to be fancy like the last one. To be honest, this site was going to be more of a factory than a home. All we really needed was a roof over our head, and seeing how it was already day 2, I felt that we were already falling behind. Once the house was finally complete, it was time to get to work. And that meant sleepless nights. Our first real task was to make algal blends, a combination of kelp and clay. This was the base for another material known as andesite alloy. These alloys were going to be crucial if we wanted to make any of the machines. And there are a lot of machines to make. For the first time ever, I actually found myself mining andesite. And with it, I crafted our first machine. We also needed to dip our toes in Tinker's construct. I made a little smeltery, and then I went down into the cave to mine some ores. After a day's worth of mining, we finally had all the supplies and all the tools we needed to make our first machine.
We have technology.
We made a mechanical press, a machine that flattens ingots into sheet metal. All that innovating worked up an appetite, and with no food, we needed to start a farm. After that, it was crucial that we made the other machines and then upgraded them, with one of the first upgrades being the addition of a conveyor belt. We were one step closer to automation because now we could have the items move from point A to point B all by themselves. Little by little, piece by piece, we added more machines to our factory, including this mechanical saw. Gone are the days of primitive axes. After that, we decided to take a little stroll through the woods, and that's when we came across a suspicious sight. Now at this point, our main problem was getting ingots. You see, every time we put ore in a furnace, we wouldn't get ingots, we got nuggets. And it takes 9 nuggets to make an ingot. So we needed to find a way to get the most out of our ore, which brings us to the millstone. It's a grinder that turns your ore into powder. We then took the powder and washed it with water using our mechanical fan. We got more nuggets than we would have if we just put it in a furnace. But we needed to take it a step further. If we combined the millstone with the mechanical fan, we could have our ores grinded and washed and then put in a chest, all without having us interfere. While I was working on that, Noah was deep underground, working on a project of his own. Remember, we needed andesite, and a lot of it. So what better way to get that than by making an andesite generator? Blocks come out, they get broken, and then they go into the chest. Up on the surface, Xavier tinkered away at his own machine. He made an assembly line, and this assembly line allowed us to produce machine parts that would be essential for making every other thing in this mod pack. I then remembered you could buy things through the marketplace, but I didn't have any coins. Luckily for me, one of the tasks was pretty simple. All I had to do was write a reason why I needed money, and it was just given to me. With my coins, I was able to buy a profession. Being a carpenter looked pretty easy, so I went with that. I could now sell wood for cash. My next goal was to build a kelp farm. You see, I was getting pretty sick of having to swim out into the ocean for kelp, so why not just grow it in the lake? And to add on to that, why not build a machine that automatically harvests the kelp and takes it to where it needs to go? But one of the materials I needed was slime, and well, there wasn't a single slime to be seen. Luckily, slime was craftable. The only thing I needed was some lime dye. So I left the island. I set sail with the hopes that I would find the materials to make lime dye. Then I discovered some ruins. I explored a little and found out that some of the pots actually had some loot in them. Nothing spectacular, but it was fun anyway. As the sun set, I made my way through what looked like the aftermath of a forest fire. The ground, the trees, the plants, everything was charred. Other than that, there wasn't much to see, so I made my way back home. But I did find some ferns along the way, and with ferns, I could actually grind them into dye. Now that I had my slime, I could finally complete my machine. After that, I decided to clean up the area. I wanted to make the platform a little wider, just make it more pleasing to the eye. As for Xavier, he was working on a new machine that I had never seen before. This looked like a pretty powerful device, and I was waiting for something amazing to happen, but... Anyways, the next morning I logged in to find out that Xavier made a new addition to our base. After that, it was time to generate more materials, including sand as well as wood. Thanks to Noah's automatic tree farm, that was going to be easy. It was now time to connect all the machines to make one super machine. Everyone got to work. Xavier started making new generators, Noah was trying to figure out a way to get his blocks up to the surface, and I laid the foundation for our new assembly line. Halfway through, we got a surprise visit from our friend Robert. This was him after he found out how much we pay by the hour. Our andesite alloy machine was finally coming together, but I'm not gonna lie, it looked pretty ugly. Our next job was to cover it up, you know, make it look pretty. So we built a frame around it, and from there we decided to construct our first official factory. We went with an old lumber mill look, and I gotta say, I think it came out great. We also made the machine more easily accessible by adding walkways and railings, because before, well, we were just falling off into the water. After that, we needed to address our iron issue. Even though we had set up an ore refinery, it just wasn't enough. So it was time to make an iron farm. And what better way to do that than by kidnapping a couple of villagers, scaring them with a zombie, and having an iron golem spawn. Although kidnapping villagers, it's not as easy as it sounds. Those guys put up a fight.
It's time to go to heaven, my child.
Stop it, what are you doing?
Stop
it, cut it out,
Don't
help.
stop.
Before we took our new friends to the base, I discovered an underwater mine shaft and thought to myself, hey, why not take a little break? And I am so happy that I did because I hit the jackpot. Shortly after, Noah and I set up the villagers there at the dock. After that, it was time to build the iron farm. Now I'm gonna be frank, the iron farm design wasn't mine. I got it off of a YouTube video, so there's that. The trickiest part of putting this all together was actually getting the villagers into the farm. We had to set up a little rail system so that we could push them into carts, and then cart them all the way to the top. I'm sorry. Did I say that was the hardest part? No. The real hardest part was actually getting a zombie to go into the tiny little 1x1 hole that we had made for it. And just when I had finally done it, this happens. We got it done eventually, and after that, we had more iron than we knew what to do with. With everything we had accomplished, it was time to move on to the next chapter. Noah and I hopped on a boat, and we set sail because now we had to find a material known as skystone. That could only be found in meteors. It didn't take long until we found some, and after we mined the whole thing, we then came to the realization that we only needed one block. But why did we need it? The skystone was an ingredient for a recipe to make destabilized redstone, a type of red liquid that we would be using for our next assembly line. We also needed to familiarize ourselves with new technology, such as pipes and pumps and spouts and all things having to do with transporting molten metals. Thankfully, Xavier had already set that up for us. His little machine was everything we needed to get started. Good thing too, because it was time to grow some crystals. More specifically, Certus quartz. And the only way to grow it was by spraying a tiny seed with a little bit of water. But before we could move forward, we had to lay an old friend to rest. Robert's corpse had been decomposing in the factory for a while, and at this point it was something of a safety hazard. With that chore out of the way, we could finally move forward. If we were going to grow more crystals, we needed a little bit of room. So it was time to make another building, but this one was going to be different. At this point, wood was just simply too primitive. If we were going to build something, it needed to be made out of a material that reflected our current technological standing. It was time to upgrade to brick. At least the floor was going to be made out of brick. The rest of the building was going to be made out of granite, and for some reason people hate this block, but I think it's kind of nice, so yeah. After a couple days, the building was finally taking shape. I spent a lot of time putting the windows together, but I think it was absolutely worth it because just look at how the sunlight passes through them. With the walls up, all we had to do now was just build the ceiling, and after that, we would be set to move forward. And even though I had built most of the thing by myself, Noah eventually decided to join me, but he didn't get very far. We laid out the conveyor belt, set up the pipe system, and we even did a little landscaping on the outside. It was simply a matter of figuring out what was gonna go where. Now, we were working with limited space. Granted, we could have made the building bigger, but I didn't. So the task at hand was to figure out a way to condense all the machines in a way where they would still work. For example, instead of making a conveyor belt go from one end of the room to the other, we were just gonna have the conveyor belt go in a circle. It saves space, we can grow crystals, and thanks to the mechanical arm, we can have those crystals move from one belt to another. The next day, we made another new addition to the factory. Do you remember that sky stone we collected from the meteor? Well, this area was dedicated just to that. Grinding the sky stone, mixing it with water, and making sky stone solution, the black liquid in the tank. In order to get this liquid from point A to point B, we were gonna need a lot of pipes, which meant we were also gonna need a lot of copper. Now copper, well, I just didn't feel like mining it. It took too long, and if we were gonna mine it, we were just gonna get nuggets back, and we needed ingots. So instead, I decided to put my trade to use. I was gonna sell some wood, make some coins, and see if we could just buy some. It wasn't even worth it. A stack of wood for 1 silver coin? That's a scam. I quit my job as a carpenter and instead became a blacksmith. I could sell armor for 4 pieces of silver, and it wasn't a problem because we had unlimited iron thanks to our iron farm. Now things were going great, but we ran into a problem. You see, before, we were able to power all of our machines with water using the water wheel. But ever since we transitioned to the furnace generator, all of our power has been coming from burning wood. So it was time for Noah to switch on the old wood farm. The only problem was that the saplings had overgrown the actual machine. And when we switched it on, the trees were actually moving with the saws. We then decided to explore new technologies such as the mechanical crafter, basically an automatic crafting table. Just the thing we needed if we were going to produce more Certus quartz seeds. 1 crystal goes in, 2 seeds come out. Speaking of crystals, Noah was working on a rig that would allow us to recharge Certus quartz. And once he finished his loop, we finally had a source of destabilized redstone. With all the machines finally working together in beautiful harmony, we could finally craft our next item, polished rose quartz. And with the polished rose quartz, we were going to make electron tubes. But the only way we could make that was if we had a steady flow of iron going into the factory. And the iron, it had to be melted. Now at this point, the only way we could melt iron was with our smeltery, but we could only melt 3 ingots at a time, so you can imagine that was going to take way too long. So Noah got to work, and he built us a new smeltery which was directly under the iron farm, and thanks to the power of droppers, the iron would instantly fall into the smeltery, melt, and thanks to a series of pipes, it would then be transported into the factory, where it would then be deposited onto the polished rose quartz, thus creating electron tubes. Now before we could finish the assembly line, we needed a steady flow of brass. This meant we would have to construct a new area next to our brick building, an area dedicated to melting ores and mixing them. And the only way to make brass was by mixing copper and zinc. Then all of a sudden out of nowhere, Xavier joined the game. For some reason, Noah was very aggressive towards him, then Xavier decided to kill him after accusing him of committing treason. It was time to make 3 large vats. 2 of the vats would connect to mixers, and once the mixers mixed all the stuff together to create brass, then the brass would be pumped into the 3rd vat, where it would be stored until we needed it. Now here I am minding my own business, then all of a sudden we're getting raided. Noah must have killed an illager or something because these guys just came out of nowhere. And one of the Ravagers almost killed me. Luckily we beat the raid, but it came at the cost of Noah's life. Then after that, a creeper found its way into our house. Poor guy, he looked pretty comfy. Now we could have taken it a step further, but I was getting a little tired of being in the factory. I wanted to build, so I decided to build something that would be useful. Now in this mod pack, it was possible to harness the power of wind, so I decided to make a windmill. Now, when I was building the windmill, I just built it with the intent that it was going to be cosmetic. And this ended up being one big decoration. I knew this thing was going to be huge, and over the course of multiple Minecraft days, I ended up creating something that would tower over everything else we had already built. Now once I had built the tower, it was time to install the blades, and this part proved to be trickier than I thought it would be. In order for this to actually work, we ended up having to craft glue, and to be honest, I didn't even know that was a thing until we needed it. But when all was said and done, we finally had a beautiful working windmill. But the blades were kinda small, so yeah, that needed to be fixed. But once they were bigger, everything just came together. After that, I built the roof, and the windmill was finally complete. Now, by the time the windmill was up, we were nearing the end of our 100 days. And I'm not gonna lie, we weren't even halfway done. There was still so much that we had yet to invent. But even though we had so much to cover in the future, it was nice for the three of us to just stop and admire what we had already accomplished. Our journey with this mod pack was far from over. It looks like we're gonna need another 100 days. It felt so good to be back in this mechanized mod pack. And last time we learned so much. We had a lot to do and very little time to do it. So the first thing we did was upgrade some of our buildings. And thanks to the machines we had, getting the materials was gonna be a breeze. But seriously, these were some pretty handsome upgrades. Like many of the greats, we start our adventure at the bottom, or in this case, underground, in a site that will become our new brass refinery. Now, if you already forgot, you can melt metals in this mod, and then you can mix those metals to make new metals. So this whole area was going to be dedicated to that, melting the metals, mixing the metals, and making new stuff. And the main thing that we wanted to make was brass, a combination of copper and zinc. You see, we were in the brass age, and a lot of our machines required that specific material. And every machine in that factory was going to be powered by our windmill. Although it was a pain having to climb all the way to the top just to switch it on. I'm sure there was a better way to do it, but you know me, couldn't be bothered to figure it out. I went back below and I was pleased to see that the windmill was already doing its job. So I decided to go back to the surface. We still didn't have an enchanting table, so I grew sugarcane for paper. You probably also noticed that my shaders are off now. Well, that's because my game was starting to lag, and I'm guessing it's because of all the machines that we were running. So I decided to tinker with the settings, and this happened. There was a glitch where the textures for tons of blocks just disappeared. Even in the forest. None of the trees had leaves, and it really reminded me of those old Herobrine hauntings. So I turned the shaders back on, but that didn't seem to solve the lag issue. So I decided to get back to work. I needed to get some more leather. You see, there wasn't a single cow on this island. Animals just stopped spawning. A result of our progress. Anyways, there was a crafting recipe. All I needed to do was combine a bunch of rotten flesh, and then I got rotten leather. Put that in a furnace, and boom! You have regular leather. After that, I went to go kill some time by working on the brass machine. I built a couple of smelters to melt down the copper and the zinc. I connected the smeltery to the mixers, and we were set. All we had to do now was test it. But first, it was time to harvest our sugarcane. After that, we made books, followed by bookshelves, and oh my goodness, is that who I think it is? Anyways, we finished the machine, and then after that it was time to beautify the area. I even installed one of those trading blocks so that we could buy copper and zinc from the market. Reason being was that if this was going to be effective, then we needed a lot of ingots and a lot of money.
And there's no money in here.
More on that later. Once the ingots were melted and mixed, the molten brass was pumped through the pipes and ended up in a nice vat on the second level. There were two other vats, one for copper and one for zinc, but it was going to be a while until we filled those as well. Now I do want to say that everything was running smoothly, because everything was running smoothly, everything except my frame rate, so we're turning the shaders off. Sorry. After that I killed some zombies, got some XP, and finally finished building the enchantment table. Though I couldn't enchant because I didn't have enough XP, so that was going to have to wait again. Now it was time to get back to work. If you remember in the last video, we started an assembly line, but we didn't finish it. We got as far as making the electron tubes, those little red bulbs, but after that, that was it. We also had a second problem. The factory wasn't fully automated. We were powering everything with a furnace, and to keep that factory running, we had to keep things burning. So we needed a way to keep the furnace burning 24/7 without us having to put in more wood by ourselves.
Hi, Nog here. The solution was simple actually. Step 1. Build a tree farm. Trees would grow, and the saws would spin and cut them down. Step 2. Transporting the wood. Once the trees were cut down, the blocks would cross a bridge to the factory via conveyor belt. Step 3. The blocks would be moved across the factory floor, drop into the hoppers, and be deposited into the generator. Infinite power!
But before we could do any of that cool stuff, like Noah said, I had to build the bridge. Thankfully, next to our near infinite supply of granite coming from Noah's auto miner, we had lots of materials to work with. Now Noah insisted that we build something simple, I mean, we just needed a bridge to get wood from point A to point B, but I don't like to roll that way. If we were gonna have a bridge, it was gonna be a nice bridge, one that matched with our granite factory. Now, the only thing that was bothering me was the idea of the conveyor belt actually going over the bridge. It was gonna look ugly having a conveyor belt there. So, I made sure to leave some space underneath the floor so that the conveyor belt could just go right through it. We would walk over it, we wouldn't have to see it, and in the end, we ended up with a beautiful walkway. One that was beautiful and functional. It was everything we needed it to be. After that, I decided to check on Noah's storage system. We had some pretty big projects in mind, and we were gonna need a lot of blocks. But before we could design our next factory, we needed to finish the assembly line. This new assembly line would require us to use a new type of design. You see, we had used the mechanical fan before, but not in this way. Instead of using the fan to push items forward, we were gonna use it to push items up. In order for this to work, the items were gonna need something to pass through. So, we took some chutes, we stacked them up, and we created a type of vents. This would allow the electron tubes to pass straight up into the second floor. From there, the electron tubes would go through a series of belts and chests and sorters, until they finally reached their final destination, the hands of the deployers. Our assembly line was finally complete. With the steady flow of electron tubes, we now had precision mechanisms, basically an upgraded version of the kinetic mechanisms we made in the first video. I was getting ready to plan the next factory, and then Robert returned. He wanted to pay his respects to the corpse he had left behind in the last video. It was truly a touching moment. One of reflection, remorse, and ultimately, rebirth. Robert was ready to move on and join us in our industrial ambitions, so we gave him a tour of the factory. Robert took a look around, and he made sure our factory was up to code. Although, now that I look back on it, he may have been a corrupt safety inspector, because we caught him tampering with our machines. The tour ended with a special viewing of our factory grounds from the windmill's observation deck. But that wasn't good enough for Robert. He insisted that he get a view fit for a king, so we climbed over the safety rail and clawed his way to the top of the windmill's roof. Robert found numerous safety violations in our factory, and he wanted a bribe if we were to pass our inspection. In exchange for his discretion, Noah paid him everything he deserved. It was time to build the next factory. Now, we are not the most technically innovative group of Minecrafters. You see, we were kind of hitting some bottlenecks. We needed more items and we couldn't get them fast enough, so instead of making them, why not just buy them? Our problem was that we were a little short on cash. Most of our money was made by selling armor, but it just took way too long crafting the armor and then putting each piece in there one by one only to get a measly 8 pieces of silver. So we decided to tinker with the concept of making a money machine. We would accomplish this by making a second iron farm identical to the one we had made last time. Only this one was going to be hooked up to a series of conveyor belts that would transport the iron and craft armor for us automatically. We began by building the iron farm, and then digging a simple hole underneath for our mechanical crafters. After that, we set up a series of chests connected to hoppers, which were linked to the mechanical crafters. The idea was that the iron from the chests would automatically go into the crafter and make the pants for us. The only tricky issue that we encountered was actually getting the iron into the chests. There were many ways of going about this, and we are not the brightest when it comes to doing redstone. So this was going to be quite the hurdle to overcome. Looking back on it now, we may have overcomplicated the design. There was probably a more simple way to do this, one that required less hoppers, but that's what we ended up with. So in short, iron goes from the iron farm onto the conveyor belts, and then from the conveyor belts it goes through the hoppers, and then from the hoppers it goes into the chests, and then from the chests into the mechanical crafter, where they would be converted into iron pants. The iron pants would then go into the trade station, and there they would be traded for silver coins, which would then be deposited into a little bank chest, and voila, we had a money machine. Now, it looked pretty ugly being exposed out in the open like that, so we decided to make a new building around it. In the basement level where we had the mechanical crafters, we decided to polish that up as well. We even put some chests, making a little storage room. Shortly after, I wanted to reap the fruits of our labor, so I took some of the coins we had earned from the machine and converted them into gold coins. And with 1 gold coin, we were able to buy diamonds. And not only diamonds, but also bottles of XP. After that, we continued the construction of our new bank using the materials in the storage room below. And in the end, we had constructed something that we were proud of, a new source of income. Once we had finished building the bank, I decided to take a look around and see what else needed sprucing up. Now there were some water wheels sticking out of the ground. They were powering the iron farm, but I didn't like that they were exposed like that. So instead of digging a hole to bury them deeper, I just decided to build a dam. A hydroelectric dam, one where the water wheels would act as turbines, powering the iron farm. Now when it comes to the technical side of things, the water wheels were still going to function just as regular water wheels. Other than that, this was more of a cosmetic choice. I had to do a ton of digging. We were going to place the dam where the mountain was, and well, let's just say it was a very tedious process. After that, we filled the reservoir, and I built a little path around the edges, just wide enough to walk across. I then went inside the walls of the dam. I placed the water wheels, and then I hooked them up to the rest of the machines shortly before pouring the water. With the dam finally complete and the water wheels spinning, I decided to decorate it now. I built a pair of towers, one for each side of the dam itself. Although I didn't like the gap between the two towers, so I filled that in with a little colonnade. In the end, I ended up with something that resembled more of a cathedral than a dam, but a win is a win. I thought it looked nice. While the main structure was finally complete, there were a couple of last touches that I wanted to add, including these little waterfalls on each side, as well as a canal for the waterfalls to pour into. The last and final addition to this dam was the street lamps. You see, it was really dark in that area. I went to the top of the windmill and overlooked at everything we had already achieved, everything we built, and I thought to myself, we're running out of space here. We still had a few more factories to build, and if we wanted to keep progressing, then we had to look towards the forest and all those pesky trees that were in the way. We still had half an island, and we were done sharing it with nature. I gathered my tools and I got to work. We were going to lay the foundations for our new factory, and if we were going to do that, then I needed to be properly equipped, and that included my armor. We weren't fighting against too many mobs, so I didn't feel the need to waste iron on armor. Instead, I decided to craft myself a hazmat suit, for two reasons. Number one, it would protect me, and number two, it looked cool. We were also running out of space with our chests. We were accumulating so much wood from the wood farm and tons of stone from Noah's auto miner, so we needed to think of something quickly before we ran out of space. And that's when it occurred to me that there was a better storage system in this mod the entire time. Storage drawers. They may not look like much, but they are very spacious on the inside. Not only that, but they could be upgraded, and these upgrades would meet capacities well beyond that of a regular chest. With one storage drawer, and mind you it had very few upgrades, we were able to have 448 stacks of wood. After tinkering with the storage, it was time to start building the foundation of our new factory. We were entering Chapter 3 known as the Catharsis. And here, we were going to be experimenting with technologies way beyond our skill set. This was going to be the biggest factory yet, but I decided to pause because Noah wanted to show me something. Turns out he was working on a little side project. Similar to the wood farm, Noah made a wheat farm. But this one was automatic as well. All you had to do was have the blades spin around, they would harvest the wheat, and then the machine would put it in the chest for us. He also discovered something called a schematic cannon. Don't let the appearance fool you, this was not a weapon, it was a tool. A tool for automated building. All you had to do was build something, scan it with a blueprint, and then the cannon, it would build the design for you. And one of its best features, you could even transfer blueprints from creative worlds into survival worlds. And that's exactly what I did. Now before people call me out for cheating, oh, he didn't do it legit, oh, he's violating the rules, you have to understand that if you want it to be built, then you have to have the items in your survival world already. If you're still confused, you'll see what I mean. I decided to give this new method a test run. So I designed a new wood shop, a place where we could sort all of our wood items, including all of the extra stuff such as apples, sticks, saplings, you get the idea. After finishing the build, I got myself an empty schematic, and I right-clicked each side so as to save the entire building. After that, I saved it, and I imported it into the other survival world. Now one thing I want to heavily clarify as to why this is legit. The schematic cannon does not spawn blocks for you. You can put the blueprint in, it'll save the design, but it won't build it unless you have a chest next to it. And inside the chests are all the items that you need to build the thing. You have to supply those items yourself. So, from here on out, every build that we were going to do, all we had to do was supply the blocks. The cannon was just going to use those blocks and make the build for us. And sooner or later, you basically have a 3D printed building. But what's a wood shop without a wood farm? So I designed another wood farm, and I'm gonna be honest, this was not my design. I got it from another Minecraft YouTuber, so yeah, thanks to you for that. His design was pretty simple. All you had to do was make sure that you had some saws attached to a cart, then the cart would go back and forth and the saws with it, chopping down all the saplings, while the arms, well, they would automatically replant those saplings. After that, all the wood and all the apples and all the saplings, they would go up into the mountain, right into the wood shop, where they would be filtered using the drawers we discovered. Now that we knew this thing was going to work for us, it was time to really put it to the test. I had finished building the new foundation for the factory, and so I decided to save it into a separate schematic and import it into the creative world. I designed a factory that would meet all of our needs for the next age. After that, I imported that back into the survival world, and I let the schematic cannon do its thing. This thing took hours to build, because we don't always have the materials to keep the cannon fueled. While the cannon was out spewing blocks, I made sure to stand by, making sure that the chest still had all the right blocks it needed. After hours of work, the cannon's job was finally complete. This was by far my favorite build out of everything else we had already constructed in this world. The inside was spacious. Noah didn't waste any time building his first machine, although there were some complications, but that's life. If we were going to complete Chapter 3, then we had many tasks to finish. Noah said that one of the first things we needed were crushing wheels. I didn't know where he was going with this, but I made them anyway and brought them to the factory. Turns out we were going to use the crushing wheels to make singularities, a new item. And what you're looking at is the assembly line that makes them. Here's how it works. It all begins with a mechanical crafter producing crushing wheels. Once the wheels are crafted, they're deposited onto a conveyor belt. There they're moved along to other crushing wheels where they are immediately grounded up. This makes a singularity. The singularity then moves up the belt and down the line until it ends up next to a dispenser with TNT. We do have to blow the item up, but not before adding a second ingredient. This machine on the floor below was responsible for making ender dust. The main ingredient was slimy ferns. After cutting up the fern into leaves, they're grounded, and that produces a type of purple blend. When you put the blend to a heat source, it cooks them, and then it becomes ender dust. You throw the ender dust in with the singularity, and then to actually combine them, you need to blow them up. This ends up creating an entangled singularity, which in turn is used to create a quantum singularity. This brings us back to the same machine that made the ender dust, only this time, we swapped out the purple fern for a blue fern. Reason being, because we weren't going to make ender dust, now we needed to make bone meal. All you have to do is take the blend and put it on a heat source, such as a campfire or a stove. This converts it into bone meal. With all that bone meal, we were going to be spam clicking a flour. This was going to be used to make more flours, because we needed an unlimited supply of dye. I ended up putting a stove next to the conveyor belt. The bone meal would go down the belt, into the deployer, and onto the flour. Now we couldn't control the direction of where the flowers popped, so we just surrounded it with hoppers all around, hoping that it would go into the chest. After that, we connected the flower chest to another mechanical belt. The idea was that the flowers would come out of the chest, go onto the belt, and enter the mechanical crafter. There they would be converted into dye and put in another chest until they're needed again. And needed they were, because we had a ton of entangled singularities. And to make the next item, you had to combine those with the dye. And after crushing them together, you get the chromatic singularity. The chromatic singularities were then transferred from their drawer to another belt, where they would be crushed once again. Our next step was to crush them to produce paintballs. One chromatic singularity was able to produce 5 colors, with magenta being the one we needed. We had a lot to pulverize, so I set up another pair of mechanical crushers. They'd pass through, they'd get crushed, and paintballs, they'd come out the other end. They stayed in storage, because we needed to figure out a way to correct their color. Remember, they all needed to be magenta. With the help of an item drain, that was possible. By right-clicking it with a paintball, the color would change. All you had to do was keep clicking it until you got magenta. Although by doing this, the paintballs did make a weird liquid that we had to get rid of. It was now time to create a filtering system. And just like our second assembly line, once again, we were going to be using the power of fans and chutes to push them upward. The end result was a very complicated looking machine. Paintballs would come out of the drawers, go into the funnels, and be pushed up by the fans. They would then come out and be dropped into the item drains. Their color would be corrected, and then they would drop down into the next funnel for the next phase. There were multiple levels with multiple item drains, because some colors needed to be corrected more than others. For example, a red paintball would need to be corrected about 4 times, whereas a blue paintball would only have to be corrected once. In the end, they would all come out as magenta. As for the waste itself, every item drain was connected to a series of pipes, and those pipes were connected to tanks that would store the waste. Before we moved on, there was a side project that I wanted to tackle. I prepped the schematic and let the cannon do its thing. Now, what did we need all those magenta paintballs for? I set up a conveyor belt, put up some mechanical crafters, and let the paintballs craft themselves into chromatic compounds. Chromatic compounds being the next item we needed. Once made, the compounds needed to be converted into refined radiance. To do this, the compound required light sources, whether that be torches or glowstone, anything that emits light. It would absorb the light and sometimes even the blocks until it converted into refined radiance. It would take a while unless you had a beacon, which would convert them instantly. And to get a beacon, well, we had to kill a wither. We had rarely gone into the nether, and I had yet to see a wither skeleton, but we could craft their skulls. Thankfully, we were able to buy one of the crafting ingredients. All we really needed was skeleton skulls. As for the money, well, it's a good thing we had a money machine, huh? I went to the bank, made a withdrawal, and then I went into my menu to buy one of the imports for that recipe. After that, I converted my silver to gold, with one stack being worth 1 piece of gold. These items were expensive. 2 gold for 1 withered rib? We couldn't buy the skeleton skulls, so we had to go get them ourselves, which required a new weapon. But before I went to go make that, I wanted to check the progress of our side project. And that schematic cannon was doing God's work. It was such a time saver. Just look at all that progress. I went back to the old workshop and dusted off the old tinker setup we had from the first video. I vaguely remembered how to do this, so yeah, if you want to know why I'm so slow about it, it's because I'm still trying to figure it out. What I did remember was that we needed an anvil to make the tool, as well as the parts for him. We didn't need anything fancy, so this new weapon was going to be made out of iron. The iron was melted down, poured into the cast, and the pieces were made. After that, we combined them in the anvil to make a new weapon called a cleaver. Now, the reason we needed a cleaver was because it had a special ability called severing. If you kill a mob with the sword, then there's a chance it may drop its head. In this case, we needed skeleton skulls, so this was going to be the tool for the job. We only needed 2 skeleton skulls since we had a 3rd wither skull just laying around. And if you don't believe me, you can look back in the video, or in the last one, it's there. It's just there. Anyways, I crafted the wither skulls, and then I put the 3 skulls together. All we needed now was soul sand. I made a quick journey to the nether to gather some, didn't want to get killed, and then I finally put on some armor after a while, and Xavier, he had left the diamond helmet in his chest, and he hadn't joined, so I'm sure he wouldn't mind. I ended up having to buy obsidian because I was going to use a technique that we used in Better Minecraft. We were going to spawn the wither under some bedrock and trap him there. I took the skulls, went into the nether portal, and then after that I started stacking up to the ceiling to reach the bedrock level. Once I had reached the top, I had to start digging. Needed to find a flat surface where I could spawn the wither, one where he wouldn't escape. Once I found my spot, I began setting up, placed the soul sand, then the skulls, and then I backed up because I did not want to get caught up if this had gone wrong. Thankfully, once he finished spawning, everything went according to plan. He was stuck in the ceiling, and there was nothing he could do about it. After that, it didn't take long before the wither was defeated, and I had gotten my nether star. He also dropped a pack of buddy cards, though I had not used that mod at all, so it didn't mean anything to me. I went back into the overworld, and by the time I had completed my quest, it looked like the clock tower was finally finished. After that, I regrouped with Noah. I gave him all the materials to craft the beacon, and from there, it was smooth sailing. He put the beacon together, switched it on, and then I gathered some chromatic compound. It was time to give it a try. But before we turned him into refined radiance, we needed to give him a little ceiling, because every time you had refined radiance and you tossed it, it would float up into the air. I'm so happy we made the beacon because the conversion time was instant. After that, we just needed to process the refined radiance with a press. We pressed them down into these thin sheets, and then after that, it was time to refine them once more with a mechanical crafter. Once processed, they were then converted into something called radiant induction coils. After that, we put them into the deployers with a magnet, and from there, we could make induction mechanisms, tier 3 of the mechanisms we were making. Now, we did rush a little bit at the end, and in the next video, if you guys want a next video, we will refine this process even further so that all the machines are connected. By this point, we had already run out of time. But I think it's safe to say that we accomplished a lot in these last 100 days. But there was still so much more that we could do. As the sun set on another adventure, Noah and I took comfort in the fact that even though we didn't finish this mod pack, well, we still had more to look forward to in the future. Well, there you have it, folks. 200 days in the Create mod. Ah yes, the journey to 300 days. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't think we were gonna get this far, especially without the use of Tinker's construct tools. Now this is a very useful mod that allows you to make custom tools and custom weapons, which is exactly what we're gonna do right now. Now the beauty of this mod is that you can customize your tool for absolutely anything. You can make your tool extremely durable, you can even make it extremely fast. The choice is yours depending on the material that you use. In this case, we were going to use Manulin, a great choice if you're looking for durability. In order to make it, you needed two types of metals, the first being cobalt and the second being ancient debris. It was time to revisit the nether, but before we could do that, we needed a sheep farm. When it comes to looking for ancient debris, I prefer to use the bed method. Going into the nether, digging straight down, and then using a bed to blow a bunch of blocks up. I think it's pretty effective. But for that, we were gonna need a ton of wool, so I bred the sheep until there was enough wool to make dozens of beds. Now beds don't stack and my shulker box was out of room, so I decided to use a toolbox. And though it had 8 slots, you could actually stack beds in it. Now the nether has never been kind to me, so to keep ourselves safe, we fortified our nether spawn. It wasn't much, but we did put up some walls. We even started a little mine shaft right behind them. I descended into the mines, and mind you, we had yet to mine anything from them, so believe me when I say that finding this cobalt immediately is not suspiciously convenient. It was time to blow things up, and when you do this, one thing to remember is that taking damage is inevitable, so be sure to watch your health because you may accidentally blow yourself up. But if you do survive, then it's payday. In short, the risk is worth the reward. By the end of my mining session, I had plenty of ancient debris. Unfortunately, we weren't done with the nether just yet. Why? Because we needed a blaze spawner. Usually we kill blazes for blaze rods, but in this case we needed the blazes dead because we wanted their blood. Now that may have sounded morbid, but blaze blood is actually just lava. In fact, it's actually hotter than lava, which is exactly why we needed it. Blocks like ancient debris, those aren't gonna melt with regular lava. If we wanted to melt those metals and get the job done, then only blaze blood was hot enough. Now I know you guys remember when I said the nether's never been kind to me. I only stepped 1 foot out the door, and that was enough to be ambushed by a mob of piglins. I didn't even know they could open the door! Thankfully, everything worked itself out. Literally all of them just ran into the portal. After I was done composing myself, I set off. I carefully bridged over the lava oceans, hoping that I wouldn't fall down. Thank God, I found a blaze spawner that wasn't that far away. I mean, we were looking for a fortress, but hey, this works too. Now the goal was to take the spawning room and convert it into a smeltery. The logic behind this was that they'd spawn, they'd die, and then the smeltery would collect the blood. I went back to the overworld, got some materials for the smeltery build, and then after that, while trying not to get myself killed, I carefully broke each block, replacing it with seared brick for the smeltery. Once it was done, it didn't take long for those blazes to start spawning and generating that sweet, sweet blaze blood. Many blazes later, we finally had buckets worth of the stuff. Back at the factory, we began our metal melting process. First with the cobalt, and then with the ancient debris. With the molten metals mixed together, we now had Manulin. I poured the molten Manulin into gold casts. And once the molten metals had cooled and solidified, I was able to take the parts out, put them on a tinker's anvil, and make the ultimate pickaxe. Now even though we had our pickaxe, we were only halfway done. You see, the pickaxe was good, but it could always be better. Now if you don't know what I mean, I'm talking about upgrades. Those that would give our durability a nice little boost. We could do this with items like the obsidian pane. It's basically a plate of obsidian, and when you pour molten iron over it, it becomes even stronger. When you put that on your tool, you get more durability points. I also added a diamond and an emerald, not just because they look fancy, but because they added so much more durability. This pickaxe was never gonna break. In the end, I ended up making 2 more tools. A hammer, which could mine stone in a 3x3 radius, and an excavator, which was a shovel that could mine dirt in a 3x3 radius. These tools were gonna do just fine. The next task at hand was to automate our next assembly line. We last left off by making induction coils. One of the steps for doing that was by taking a chromatic compound, throwing it over a beacon, and converting it into refined radiance. At the time, we were just tossing them in manually, so we needed a way to automate this. The only problem was that this process wasn't automatic. The first thing I did was build the beacon. I even left a little hole above it so that the beam could pass straight through. The chromatic compounds were making their way towards the beacon. Once they went over the beam, they were converted, but there was only one problem. See, when a chromatic compound is converted, it begins to float. All we had to do was put a trap door. That way when they converted, they wouldn't float away. Then with the help of a mechanical fan, they would just be blown on to the next assembly line. The refined radiance was pressed into these beautiful thin sheets. The sheets would then go into a mechanical crafter where they were converted into the induction coils. After that, the items would go up the assembly line, down a series of hoppers, and straight into the deployers. Lastly, they would convert the precision mechanisms into inductive mechanisms. Finally, the catharsis was coming to a close. This was exciting because with the inductive mechanisms now at our disposal, we could craft some complex machinery. The next task was to create Invar machinery. To do that, we were gonna need a lot of Invar ingots. Now you can either make it or you can buy it, but it's super expensive, and we're cheapskates, so we're gonna make it instead. Now the main ingredient was nickel, and let me tell you, buying nickel was way cheaper than buying Invar. After that, we went back to the old factory to combine the nickel with another metal, that metal being iron. The next step was to make something called a nickel compound, and to do that you needed to combine the ingot with iron dust. Hang in there, because the next step is where things get a little tedious. The nickel compound has to be put in a blast furnace, and only a blast furnace. This makes an unprocessed Invar ingots, and the annoying thing is that these items do not stack. It won't take long before your inventory's full, so you gotta find a way to process them fast. And this is where the annoying part comes in, because to actually process it, it has to be smashed 16 times. So, we had the bright idea of making more mechanical presses. The next step was to craft Invar casing. All we had to do was take the Invar ingot and combine it with a stone block. Now it doesn't look like much, but the Invar casing would act as the foundation for every machine from here on out. The next step was to surround the casing with inductive mechanisms. And with that, we finally had an Invar machine. Now one thing I did notice while going through this process was that our original workshop, it was a little small. We were in dire need of an upgrade, so I went into the creative world and designed something new. Once I was done, I imported the design into the survival world, and I had it built with our beautiful trusty schematic cannon. The only problem was that this factory expansion was a little too big. You can actually place the blueprint down and see the building as a hologram, just to see how it would look in your world, and when I placed the hologram down, it was actually bleeding into our woodshop. So, I had to break some of our woodshop down so that this new expansion could fit. After that, I let the schematic cannon do its thing, and after a short while, we had a beautiful new addition to our factory. And the best part was that the inside was already fitted with all the machines that we needed. And underneath the floor was the furnace generator that would power it all. We had mixers, millstones, presses, whatever it was we needed, that wing of the factory, it had it. To inaugurate the newest addition to the factory, Noah decided to make himself some Invar ingots. For Noah, making Invar was a very lengthy process because I didn't help him. He had to figure it out all by himself. But after a very long time and a whole lot of Google searches, Noah was able to make himself some well-deserved Invar ingots. Now we talked about how the Invar ingots could make us machines, and up until now, everything's been powered with either water wheels, windmills, or furnace generators. But for the Invar machines, we were going to use a power called redstone flux. Generating redstone flux wasn't going to be a problem. In fact, we already had a way of doing it. We did this with a Stirling dynamo, a block that allows you to burn coal in exchange for energy. But if you want a ton of energy, then you have to figure out a way to store it. This is where the flux cell comes in. In short, it's a big battery. You get to store energy for as long as you want, and whenever you need it, you simply take it out, power your machines. But if we really wanted to use this block, then there were a couple of items that we had to craft first. With the help of our handy Invar machines, we were able to craft an induction smelter. It's basically a fancy furnace that can combine metals. And the first step to making the flux cell was by making a new metal called constantan. All you gotta do is take copper and nickel, put them in the induction smelter, and you're all set. We then used the metals to make a constantan gear, a necessary item for the flux cell frame, the frame being the basis for the flux cell. I then made a few flux cells and added the Stirling dynamos on top. Once I put the coal in, power was being generated and transferred into the cells. I wanted to tinker with the design, so I added some drawers, furnaces, even hoppers, hoping to come up with something that could generate infinite power. But in the end, I didn't like the way it looked. It was too bulky, and I wanted something a little smaller. I made some Invar flux ducts, which were basically cables that could transfer the power into the machines. Machines like the pyrolyzer. It's basically a super furnace. You put stuff in, and it charged it even more. After that, we did a little reorganizing. All of our drawers were now in the wood shop. And the best part was that the wood shop was conveniently located next to the machine shop. Now that was a real time saver. After that, it was time to begin the next chapter titled Into the Box. And to get started, there were 4 things that we needed to accomplish, with the first task being sand generation. We needed a lot of sand. We also needed more space in our factory, so it was time to build a second wing. Unfortunately, the side of our new wing was occupied by all of these gross trees. Our only choice was to remove them, because progress never stops. With the help of a controlled fire and our trusty excavator, we were able to clear out the trees and build our brand new wing. When it came to the looks of the interior and exterior, this new wing was exactly identical to the other one. With a brand new addition to the factory, we could finally produce sand. We were gonna do this with crushing wheels. At this point, crushing wheels were a little outdated. I mean, we could have used a machine called a pulverizer, but Invar, it's really expensive. First, I laid out the conveyor belt, and then after that, I got the crushing wheels up and running. We used Noah's trusty cobblestone generating design. And even though we're all about progress and advancing towards the future, sometimes it's okay to look back and reference the old ways. The cobblestone was being generated, going down the assembly line and being crushed by the crushing wheels. On the other side, we would get sand, clay, sometimes even flint. We only needed the sand, so we set some funnels up and filtered the other items out. After that, the next step was to wash the sand. By washing it, you produce a ball of sand. Now normally we'd use a mechanical fan, but we were excelling to new technologies, introducing the fluid encapsulator. In short, it's a fancy washing machine. And this is where the power of redstone flux comes into play because we had energy to power it. Look at all that juice! Although we did have to pump the water from underneath the factory into the fluid encapsulator because water, well, you can't make it out of thin air. Finally, we automated another system. Sand goes in, balls of sand come out. But we weren't done yet, because the balls of sand had to be refined even further. We had to convert the balls into sand chunks. We could actually do this by taking them, putting them over an item drain, and having the rest of the sand filter through. This process would turn the ball of sand into sand chunks, and the excess sand, it would be filtered into a tank where we'd save it for later. We were almost done with the whole sand process, but before we could go any further, we were gonna need lava. Specifically, 1 bucket of lava. What should have been a simple task was blown extremely out of proportion. We were this far into the Create mod, and we had yet to make ourselves an infinite lava source. The design you're about to see was inspired by another YouTuber. To get infinite lava, we were gonna start with 2 nether portals and a conveyor belt in between them. I set up some pipes and even a couple of spaces for our large lava tanks. After that, I went to the nether to set up the machine on the other side. I used a new block called a hose pulley. With the crank attached to the side, I could lower the hose down into the lava and pump it straight from the source. But how are we going to power these pumps? Well, once again, we were going to reference the old ways, wind power. Instead of building an entire windmill, I made a contraption out of wool. It would still capture the wind, turn the cogs, and pump the lava. Back in the overworld, I ended up destroying the other portal because we just didn't need it. Now some of you may be wondering how exactly this machine's gonna work. It's pretty simple. A bucket goes in, and lava comes out. But if you really want a detailed explanation, then here it is. Empty buckets go on the assembly line. They travel around the conveyor belt until they go into the nether portal and out the other side. In the nether, they rotate around until they reach a spout, which fills the bucket with lava. Once the bucket's filled, it goes back to the overworld. It goes down the assembly line until it reaches an item drain. After that, the bucket is emptied. The lava's pumped through the pipes, and it goes into the lava tank. The empty bucket goes back into the portal, and the cycle begins all over again. Now you may be asking yourself, how are they powering this all? That's an excellent question. Once again, we reference the old ways because good old wind power never fails. So why did we put ourselves through all of that trouble? Well, I promise it's worth it. Now that we had our lava, we could finally begin the next step of this chapter. It was time to make basalt. With our 1 block of lava, blue ice, and some soul soil, we were able to produce the block, and we used Noah's cobblestone generating design to break it. The next step was where things got extremely complicated. More complicated than I want to admit. It was time to use an item called the alchemical laser. So why did we need basalt? We needed to convert the blocks into something called basalt shards. And the only way to make that conversion was with the alchemical laser. Now my plan was a simple one. We were going to take the basalt and put it in a minecart. Along with the basalt, we were also going to throw in a magnet. A necessary item if we were going to make this conversion. The minecart would sway from side to side while I turned the crank around with the hopes that eventually the laser would zap the minecart. With a machine like this, timing was key. And in the end, I ended up designing one of the most complicated contraptions we had ever built on this server. It took up way too much space and it was ugly and sometimes it didn't even work. I wanted to take the machine and refine it even further. And the only way for me to do this was to first go to the nether and make infernal mechanisms. The next step was to collect vines from the nether, the blue ones and the red ones, and to be honest, I don't know their names, but that's what we needed. The plan was to farm them, and with the help of my trusty sledgehammer, I was able to clear a space where I could plant them and watch them grow. I planted them in neat little rows, and then after that I built the assembly line for the infernal mechanisms. All you needed was liquid soul and 3 spouts of lava. But how does one make liquid soul? That's where the vines come in. You put both of them in the basin, both red and blue, and then they get mixed together. The byproduct is liquid soul, which is then pumped into a storage tank until we need it for later. Now, one thing I forgot to mention was that when it comes to infernal mechanisms, we're not building them from the ground up. We're actually making a conversion using precision mechanisms. To make the conversion, it's like I said before, 1 squirt of liquid soul and 3 of lava. This was a really fun side quest, but the question remains, why did we actually need these? We needed an item called zinc machines, a necessary block to condense our assembly line. To make the machine, you start off with a simple zinc casing, and once you have that item, surround it with infernal mechanisms to make the zinc machine. It's important to know that this block can be converted into a number of helpful items, some of which were going to help us for this next assembly line. The basalt machine was taking way too much space, and like I said before, I wanted to condense our machine to something a little smaller, so that's where the igneous extruder comes in. We were able to cut that size down to 1 block. It's basically a stone generator, and its block output is way higher than the original machine, so this was a win-win. We wanted to condense our alchemical laser machine, and that we did, thanks to the help of YouTuber Rage Plays Games. Bear with me when I go ahead and explain how it works. It all starts at the igneous extruder, our basalt generating machine. The blocks are generated, and then, via item pipe, they're transferred to a block called a minecart loader. And the minecart loader does exactly that. Once there were 4 stacks of basalt in there, a signal would be sent. While traveling, it would be zapped by the alchemical laser, converting all the basalt into basalts. The minecart was now over a block called the minecart unloader, and then from the unloader into another block called a pulverizer. The pulverizer would then take the basalt shards and crush them into basalt's powder. The powder was then transferred to a basin, where it would be crushed even further by a mechanical press. After being pressed together, you had earth charges, which were then transferred via item pipes into storage drawers. On the other side of the skill tree, we had to convert snowballs into blizz cubes, and the process was identical to that of the earth charges. You had an alchemical laser, there were pulverizers, there was mechanical presses. In the end, the snowballs were converted into blizz cubes. Then with the help of a pulverizer, the blizz cubes were then turned into blizz dust, which in turn was converted into ice charges. Earth charges, ice charges, we had them both, but we weren't going to need them until later, because we had more things to make, like a new building. I had the schematic cannon working on a secret project while we were working inside the factory, and this project was massive. Our largest addition to this world yet, we were building a power plant. While that was being built, I decided to connect all of our machines onto one assembly line. We were going to take all of our products, the earth charges, the ice charges, the sand chunks, they were all going to go on one assembly line to be combined into our next mechanism. Once again, item pipes proved to be extremely useful. We were able to transfer the items into the induction smelter, which would then combine them both into something new. With the sand chunks and earth charges combined, you get purified sand. The purified sand is then moved into a basin. It's combined with fine sand and coke chunks. Where did the coke chunks come from? Well, we had another machine on the 2nd floor. To make coke chunks, you have to put charcoal into a pyrolyzer. The pyrolyzer burns the charcoal even more, making coke. This coke is basically charcoal 2.0. It's better than charcoal in every way. To make the coke chunks, the coke is then squirted with water twice. Then it's cut into pieces by the saws. Once the chunks are done, they move into the item pipe and down into the basin, where they are mixed with the purified sand and the fine sand. The result is a silicon compound. The silicon compound is then moved from the basin into an induction smelter. There it's going to be combined with ice charges from Noah's snowball machine. The ice charges are transferred from the snowball machine to the induction smelter via item pipe. Once they enter the induction smelter, the items are combined to make silicon. The item is then crushed under an inscriber silicon press. This makes printed silicon. Kinda looks like a microchip. The new item once again goes into the item pipes, up into a chest, and down a sequence of hoppers where it's then put into the deployers, which will then convert our inductive mechanisms into calculating mechanisms. That process took way longer than it should have, because by the time we had wrapped things up, our power plant was finally complete. Crowned with glass ceilings and 4 diorite smokestacks, this power plant would act as the beating heart of our industrial paradise. It was taller, it was wider than anything we had built. Comprised of 3 levels, each floor would serve its own special purpose. It was pretty cool. And the first thing we needed to do to start generating power was build, you guessed it, a tree farm. This was going to be your stereotypical coal power plant. And how do you get charcoal? Well, you gotta burn a ton of logs. Similar to the wood farm design from the last episode, the only thing we did here was just make it even bigger. More saplings, more saws, more deployers, more wood. Now the tree farm was on the top level. 1 floor below was going to be the furnace room. There, with the help of multiple furnaces, we were going to burn that wood. The wood was going to be carried via item pipes. The pipes would transfer it from furnace to furnace, all of which would burn them up. The logs would go down the chutes, into the fire, and at the bottom they would come out as charcoal. They dropped through another series of chutes until they finally ended up in a Stirling dynamo. And that's where our power was being generated. The coal was being burned by the Stirling dynamo to generate redstone flux, the lifeblood of all of our machines from here on out. And all of that power was being stored in our flux cells, those giant beautiful batteries that we made a few minutes ago. That's what we were going to use them for. Once we had completed the first side of the power plant, I went back to review every single floor, and I gotta say that the designs, well, let's just say they demonstrate how far we've come. This power plant and all of its machines were gonna be a real gem. The only problem was that I forgot to build a door. I mean, we had the 2 gaping entrances on both sides, but there was no way to get to them unless you had a grappling hook, something I didn't have. Jokes aside, I didn't forget to build the door. The design was intentional because the only way to get into this building was gonna be via train. That's right, we were finally gonna build trains. But before you build trains, you have to make train tracks. So, that's what I did. I built the platform, laid down the tracks, made sure that everything looped around perfectly for the train, and then it was time to design our locomotive. To tell you the truth, I think I'm better at designing buildings than actual vehicles. This was kinda tricky, but I thought it came out okay at the end. I mean, it looked like a train, kinda. Now, before I unveiled the design of the train, one thing I had to take into consideration was we needed train tracks on the outside. I mean, where was the train line going to start? Where was it going to end? And at the time, I thought that I was going to start the line at our original building. After 3 videos, it was finally time for Old Faithful to come down. With my axe in hand, I began to tear down the walls, then the ceiling, and then I realized that was just taking way too long, so I opted to set it on fire. It was nice while it lasted. Well, there she is, in all of her glory, our beautiful train. For something that's held together with glue, I think it looks pretty good. But above all else, does she work? Yes. Yes, she does. Thanks to the help of our cart assembler, the minecart was able to move multiple blocks, and in this case, that was our train. It wasn't an elytra, but it beats walking. It could also take us across oceans. I mean, we did have the train design, which means we could make more train stops, more train tracks. Now our reach was limitless. We had finally reached day 300. To christen the 300th day of our survival challenge, it was time to finally complete the 4th chapter. It was time to make an ME controller, the one block that would catapult us into the digital age. Everything that we've worked on, everything that we had accomplished, all of it was leading up to this moment. One that the Modpack had dubbed the finale. And after taking a peek at the skill tree for the next chapter, I could tell that this was going to be a real grand ending. We've come a long way since day 1. From a simple hut to our palaces of progress, our industrial paradise with the help of all of its machines was ready to set its sights on some cosmic aspirations. The first day of our next 100 days started off relatively simple. There were a number of things that we had to accomplish on this journey, and the first thing that we were going to tackle was making plastic. Now, to make this plastic ingot, you needed 9 of these little microplastics. To combine them, you needed to place them inside of a basin over a superheated blaze burner. And to get this blaze burner superheated, you had to feed it blaze cakes. If we were going to build a rocket ship and go to the moon, we first had to bake a cake. You needed 4 simple ingredients: sugar, eggs, and cinder flour. You combine them all together to make a blaze cake base, but to complete the recipe, you have to fill the base with lava. So, our first step was to go get some eggs. We didn't have any chicken farms, but there were plenty of birds on the island, so we went out into the wild to see what we could gather. Now, we were only able to find one chicken, but we did find a couple of seagulls and a few kiwi birds. Now that we had the eggs, the next step was to grind netherrack into cinder flour. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that cinder flour was made out of netherrack. But it is a blaze cake, so that seems to make some sense. Once we had cinder flour, the only thing left was to get the sugar. Thankfully, we had a sugarcane farm, and once we had that, it was time to combine them all and make the blaze cake base. With the base prepped and ready to go, there was only one thing left to do. I made my way to the nether and placed the bases on the conveyor belt. One by one, each cake would get its lava filling before heading back into the overworld. On the other side of the portal was a beautiful line of blaze cakes ready for the taking. Now that we could heat the blaze burner, it was time to make some plastic. And to do this, we were gonna need something called a matter condenser. This purple block was essential to make plastic. There was no other way, so we had to craft it. The main two ingredients were going to be the ME controller, a block we made in the last video, and a Fluix pearl. We took the Fluix crystal, grounded it up, and made some powder, and after that, we surrounded the ender pearl with all the crafting materials. I crafted the matter condenser, and then after that I had to buy some Certus quartz for our next crafting recipe. We needed to craft a storage component. It's basically a type of chip that would go inside the matter condenser. Basically, the chip stores energy and converts it into plastic. Unfortunately, we had a little workplace accident in the process.
0 days without a workplace accident. That just happened. Let's move on.
No!
Why do you...
Why
Why are you dying that way?
It was time to power the matter condenser. The machine feeds on blocks. One block equals one energy. So we placed down an igneous extruder, basically a fancy cobblestone generator. For every second that went by, one cobblestone was generated from the extruder and transferred via item pipe into the matter condenser, where the block was converted into one energy. It took a whole lot of energy to make one matter plastic, so we needed to find a way to feed tons of items into the matter condenser. Not only did it accept blocks to convert into energy, but it accepted any item. Even saplings, which we had a ton of thanks to our wood farm. With a massive influx of saplings going into the matter condenser, we were generating enough energy to produce matter balls at a faster rate. I set a second matter condenser down so that we could produce twice the amount of matter balls. I would just leave them there and come back to them later when we had more plastic to harvest. At this point, we did have some plastic to work with, so we could get some of the smaller crafting recipes out of the way, like a spacesuit. I took whatever matter balls we had collected and put them into the basin so that we could heat up the blaze burner and smash it all into plastic ingots. To make the spacesuit, you had to actually use a mechanical crafter. A regular crafting table wasn't going to work, so I put the pieces in. Flattened gold, a couple of plastic ingots, and to be honest, I'm surprised this wasn't that expensive to make. With the helmet complete, we moved on to the other parts of the spacesuit, including the boots, the pants, and the chest piece, which was surprisingly different from the other pieces because this one required an oxygen tank, something we had to fill later. We were early into our 100 days and we finally had a full-fledged spacesuit. Shortly after, Noah and I began to clear the trees for our next big project. With a little fire, anything's possible. Throughout the night, the forest burned in the flames of progress. It was a true sight to behold. With the forest cleared, it was time to start terraforming. We needed a good foundation for our next big structure. Noah and I spent the rest of the night breaking up the land. We worked to the morning, and as the sun rose, its warm rays shined on our job well done. With the foundation complete, we can now start working on the outline for the next building, a new money machine. This new building would be larger, grander, and far more profitable than our iron golem farm. But before we could progress any further, we had to stop and preserve our history. Some things are best left unchanged. As for the money machine, well, it was going to be one big berry farm. Did I forget to mention that we were going to build two of them? My only problem was that the berry farms were going to be far away from our original factory, but I'm sure that's something we could remedy later. We began to fill up the first layer, and this is how we were going to divide the labor. I was going to work on the aesthetic tasks, making sure that this berry farm had a beautiful facade, while Noah was going to do the more technical side of things, making sure that the farm actually functioned. Through the power of teamwork, Noah and I worked simultaneously. Through the course of multiple days, we worked to ensure that this berry farm would be forged into reality as a tool that would help us on our financial endeavors. Our money machine berry farm was finally taking shape.
I'm a Barbie girl in a Barbie world. Life is plastic. It's fantastic.
Sorry you had to see that.
At the end of our project, we had a beautiful multi-leveled berry farm. On each floor were dozens of berry bushes. Each plant was being consistently harvested by the rotational harvester. All it took was one spin around for a few stacks of berries. The berries would be dropped down the funnel into the trade station where they would be then exchanged for beautiful precious silver. From this point onward, we were making way more money than ever. With the new money factory finally complete, it was time to build a pipeline. We were going to be pumping destabilized redstone from one side of the island to the other, and this liquid was going to be used to make processors, little microchips that would be helpful for making our infinite storage, and they would also be used as necessary crafting items for some of our rocket components. The design would be simple. All I had to do was dig a tunnel from one factory to another. After burrowing through the ground and collecting hundreds of blocks later, I finally reached the other factory, more specifically, the underside of the factory. I made a little staircase and went to the surface. I looked around and tried to figure out what was gonna go where. After that, it was time to craft some pipes. All we had to do now was connect one tank to another. Compared to what we usually do, this task was probably the easiest thing I've done in a long time. The pipes were then installed along the tunnel wall. And if you're wondering why I decided to put the pipes underground instead of up on the surface, well, it was just an aesthetic choice. I mean, have you seen what the inside of our factory looks like? After that, it was time to recycle some old parts. In the metals building, we had some old fluid tanks that we just weren't using. So, I had to demolish them and take them to the other factory so that we could repurpose them. The last item on our to-do list was to install fluid pumps. Now, as you know, this is a very long pipeline, and such pipelines require multiple pumps, because if we only had one, that single pump wouldn't have enough power to take the liquid from one end of the pipeline to the other. I wanted to make sure that this thing was going to work, so I converted the fluid pipes into glass fluid pipes. That way I could actually see if the fluid was flowing through. With the pipeline now complete, it was time to assemble the fluid tank. Now this was a fairly large tank, and I'm pretty sure we weren't going to use all the storage inside, but it looked cool, so I kept it. I switched the pipeline on, and all of the cogs were rotating, the pumps were pumping. Now it was just a matter of whether or not the liquid was flowing. And thankfully it was. Usually when we switch these things on, we don't always get them working on our first try, but it was a pipeline. I mean, how could you actually mess up a pipeline? Back at the other factory, the fluid tank was getting filled with destabilized redstone. Everything was going according to plan, but there was one thing that we didn't take into account. We weren't producing enough destabilized redstone at a fast rate. So in order to resolve this problem and speed production up, we had to add a rotational speed controller to the destabilized redstone manufacturing process. Now, if you don't know, a rotational speed controller does exactly what it's named. It controls how fast the cogs spin. So, all we had to do was raise the number, and the cogs would spin faster. Quicker machines equals quicker production. While I was wrapping things up with the pipeline, Noah had started construction on a second buried tower. With too many machines at our disposal, nothing was going to be out of our reach. It was time to begin the next assembly line. Each processor would have its own dedicated conveyor belt, and above the conveyor belt would be the pipeline for the destabilized redstone. Next, I added a trio of deployers. They would install the circuits onto the printed silicon, the first step in making the processor. Next, we added some spouts to make sure that these circuits would get squirted with destabilized redstone, and after that, all we had to do was switch it on to make sure that everything was running properly. Once we got the mechanical belts running in sync, it was time to do a trial run, so I put in some circuits and some printed silicon, and thankfully, everything was running smoothly. With the working assembly line now complete, it was time to figure out how to automate the whole process. Now before you make a processor, you have to make a circuit. And to make circuits, you usually have to pour molten metal over presses. Basically, they act as casts. Now don't ask me why we chose to make the processor assembly line before the circuit assembly line, as obviously you need circuits to make processors. Though we did do a little demo during one of the first livestream sessions. In order to make this work, we needed a way to melt metals quickly. So, we decided to turn our attention to the magma crucible. This block allows you to melt down all metals, including diamonds. Once everything was melted down, the metals would be pumped into these large fluid tanks. I also wanted to incorporate a fluid valve. This would give us greater control over the flow of metals. Each tank would have its own valve, and they would all be connected to a single wheel that I would turn left to open and right to close. The next step was to connect the fluid tanks to the blast chillers. Now usually you can make circuits one of two ways. You can either pour the metals with a smeltery, or you can use a blast chiller. And since the smeltery setup was way too big to build, I decided to just take the easy route and use the blast chiller since they only took up one block of space. The setup was finally complete. The magma crucibles would melt the metals down and store them into the fluid tanks, and then from the fluid tanks they would be pumped to the blast chillers, and from the blast chillers circuits would be produced, and they would drop down into the assembly line where the circuits would then be converted into processors. All we had to do now was to buy the materials themselves. When we finally ran it for the first time, everything was running as it should have. But there was one problem, and it was a big problem. Usually it takes only one ingot to make one circuit. But for some reason the blast chiller was using 4 ingots. 4 ingots to make one circuit! Thankfully we figured out that you could actually attach pipes to casting tables and pump it in there directly, so we were back to using 1 ingot per circuit. After taking on that big task, I decided to work on a little side project. Now I know we had already built a train, and it was a nice train, at least I thought it was, but that took way too long. So in this case, we were just going to use a minecart because we were building a little rail system. I just needed something simple that would get me from point A to point B, straight from the factory to the money farm and then back to the factory again. If you like to watch the live streams, then you will know that running between the money farm and the factory takes way too long. So this was going to be a nice little way to cut the travel time in half. For the time being, I'm sure we would make some good use of this little rail system, but it was time to move on. Now I hope you brought your thinking caps because today we're going to do a little math. That's right, we were going to be making numbers. 1 through 9, including 0. We were going to be doing addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, whatever it was that would get us these numbers, we had to do it. So it was time to do the one subject I dreaded the most. But before I could start reliving the nightmare that was grade school, I had to build a few smelteries. Now what could a smeltery possibly have to do with math? Well, you have to stop and ask yourselves, what are these numbers going to be made out of? Well, the reason we were going to make smelteries was because these numbers were going to be made out of melted calculation mechanisms. Believe it or not, once the calculation mechanisms are melted down, they become liquid logic. With the smeltery setup, we were going to be pouring this liquid logic into number casts. The big problem was that we could only make casts for the numbers 8 and 3. We also had casts for the operations, you know, plus, minus, multiply, divide. So with those 4 operations and the numbers 8 and 3, we needed to find a way to produce all of the other numbers. And how do you make the other numbers? You have to do math problems. That's not a joke! If you want to get the number 5, then you literally have to put 8 minus 3 into the mechanical crafter, and then you get the number 5. We were going to have to make a lot of numbers, and the current setup that we had, though it was nice, it just wasn't going to be sufficient. So the next course of action was to build a big smeltery. On top of that, we were going to have to make what I'm just going to call a giant calculator, something that automatically did the math problems for us. Not only that, but to actually produce the numbers, we would have the liquid logic pumped into these casting tables. And in the casting tables, we would have the numbers 8, 3, and any other operation we needed to get the numbers 0 through 9. I know I've said this before, and I will say it again because every time I do stuff like this, it always gets more difficult, but this was probably the most challenging thing I've ever had to design. Thank goodness I had some reference videos. Thank you, Chosen Architect. After that, it was just a matter of connecting the actual machine to the smeltery. I had to work through a maze of pipes just to make sure that they wouldn't interfere with one another. I collected a few stacks of calculation mechanisms so that we could get them melted down. This smeltery had a massive capacity. It didn't take long before my multiple stacks of calculation mechanisms were all liquid logic. Once everything was set up, I dismantled the platform that I was using to build, and after that, I turned the machine on and everything ran beautifully. With the help of our pipe system, the liquid logic was flowing from our smeltery setup all the way over to our calculator. There, the casts were being filled with liquid logic. The numbers would then cool and solidify before going down the chute into the next mechanical crafter. There, they would be participating in the next equation to produce the next set of numbers. This was by far my favorite machine. I decided to give it the respect it deserved by building it its own wing of the factory. I decided to go for a basic design, one that was consistent with the already existing structure. Granite walls, wood fence windows. I even decided to add its own new, unique feature, a glass ceiling. The new calculator wing was finally complete. I thought it was so nice that I created the exact same design on the other side of the factory. Now the big question, why did we need all of these numbers? That glowing cube? It's called a computation matrix. The only way to make that is if we melt down all the numbers and combine them together. I gathered one stack of each number, then I put together a new smeltery setup. It's here where we would take the numbers, melt them down, and mix them all together. And there were a lot of numbers to melt down. Once we had melted enough down, they mixed automatically and produced this sparkling rainbow liquid. That was exactly what we wanted. Now up until now, I was dumping stacks of numbers into the smeltery by hand. I wanted the numbers to travel on their own, so I decided to make a transportation system made of item pipes. The numbers would flow from their storage drawers through the item pipes and into the smeltery. This was a pretty solid system. And now that we were processing numbers automatically, we could finally make our very first computation matrix. And all we had to do was pour it from the faucet into the basin. Simple as that. The result was this strange Rubik's Cube looking block. After all that hard work, it was so nice to finally have one. Only 8 more to go. Before we began our next task, I decided to pay the Money Machine Factory a little visit, only to discover that Noah had finally finished building the second berry farm tower. I needed to make a withdrawal because I was about to craft myself a very useful, yet very expensive item. I ended up buying a number of weird crafting ingredients, but trust me when I say that the payoff is worth it. Now yes, we were veering away a little from the sciencey machine stuff that we've always worked on, but a little bit of magic never hurt anybody. I was crafting a staff called a Rendingale. With the Rendingale, you could do a number of things, such as pushing mobs away. You could even use it for flying. Of course, there was the matter of actually charging the staff. I tried to use the energetic infuser, but in this case, science wasn't gonna work. We had to use magic for a magic staff. It turns out that the staff actually ran on feathers. So I bought myself some feathers, and shortly after, I was soaring through the sky. Now this was the way to travel. Now one thing I completely forgot about was the matter condenser. This whole time it was producing plastic. I decided to take whatever plastic had accumulated and smash them down into plastic ingots because it was time to move on to the next project. With all the plastic in hand, we could finally assemble some of the first few pieces for our rocket, with the first component being the actual launch pad. These crafting recipes were very simple. All we had to do was take some stone, mix it with a plastic ingot, and we got 5 launch pad blocks. The only catch was that this wasn't regular stone. This was a more denser version of stone that we had to compact together. So I went back to the berry factory, took some of the spare cobblestone, and got started on that. I wanted to see what the landing pad blocks were going to look like, and I gotta say, I love connected textures. The next step was to build the launch tower, and like the landing pad, this block was pretty cheap to make. Although to be honest, this did just look like retextured scaffolding. The next block to check off our list was the rocket assembly machine. Some of the crafting items were a pair of diamond gears. This was a pretty expensive thing to make, so it was time to make a withdrawal from the National Bank of Doublesal. Once we had the diamond gears, we took all the parts to the mechanical crafter and watched all the pieces come together to make our rocket assembly machine. With this machine, we could look at all of our rocket specs, including its thrust, its weight, how much fuel we had, and how fast it was going to be. Now that we had all the pieces for our launch pad structure, we could finally see the rocket schematic itself. When it came to the rocket's design, there were a few items to tackle, but at this point, nothing was out of our reach. Now obviously, if we're gonna go to space, then we need oxygen, we need air. Thankfully, there was a way of making that. That's right folks, we're making air. And believe it or not, the process was actually pretty simple. I wanted an area dedicated specifically for rocket stuff. I wanted a place where we could make the fuel, where we could make the air, where we could build the launch pad and the rocket itself. I began construction on a bridge. This bridge would lead to a special area where we could complete all of our rocket tasks. Once I completed the outline of the bridge, it was just a matter of filling out the floor and coming up with the design for the area where we would launch our rocket. Now, based on our current architectural surroundings, it seemed like we had a pretty common theme going on here. Granite and sandstone, you can never go wrong with those items. I began to fill out the floor of our bridge, opting for a checkered pattern. Once the floor was filled out, it was time to make the outline for the actual launch pad area itself. Now Noah had a couple of ideas of how the floor should look for this area, so I left it to him. And over the course of a Minecraft night, Noah was able to fill in the entire circle. Props to him for working overtime. As the Minecraft night was coming to an end and the sun rose from the other side of the world, Noah's new project was finally finished. With the platform out of the way, it was time to start making our oxygen. I don't want to have to install water wheels or any type of steam-powered stuff, so we were going to go with wind power. Now one thing I have yet to explain is how you actually make the oxygen itself. We were going to need zinc, copper, and water. I also added a block called an aqueous extruder. To make air, we were going to need water, and this machine made just that. With the zinc, copper, and water all combined together under a heated blaze burner, we could make oxygen. And not only oxygen, but also hydrogen. On each side of the basin were 2 tanks, one for both of the gases. With our oxygen machine up and running, we were going to produce enough air for all of our lunar expeditions. Although we were going to add a lot more to this area, so we were probably going to have to upgrade our wind power. The last thing I added was a spout. This was so that we could fill our buckets with oxygen and make oxygen tanks. Next to it, I placed a gas charge pad. I put the tanks inside the pad, and it began to fill with air. When it was filled to capacity, I stood on the pad and it filled my spacesuit with oxygen. There were a couple more steps we had to complete before we could finally start building our rocket. Our next goal was to produce rocket fuel. Now trust me when I say that the next thing we're about to do was absolutely crucial. Blaze rods? Ender pearls? What could this possibly mean? If you guessed that we're going to the end, then you are 100% correct. The end is a pretty dangerous place, so finally, for all of you who were saying make some armor, that's exactly what I'm gonna do. I also needed a weapon because we were going there with a purpose. There was a crafting item we needed, and the only way we could get it was if we killed the Ender Dragon. I wasn't gonna take the time to design some god-slaying weapon, so I decided to just use whatever leftover manualing we had and forge myself a sword. With the weapon complete, we took our Eyes of Ender and did the classic Minecraft journey, a true rite of passage, searching for the stronghold. Of course, thanks to my rending gale, this search was gonna be a breeze. While Noah was walking like a caveman, I was soaring through the sky like an eagle. Along the way, I came across some ruins, wreckage from previous innovators from days gone by. It didn't take long before my final toss went into the ground. This could only indicate one thing: the stronghold was directly beneath my feet. With my excavator, I began to break the one cardinal rule of Minecraft: never dig straight down. And let me tell you, this was a lesson I've had to relearn time and time again. After making myself a secure staircase, I finally broke through the walls and came across the ruins of the stronghold. And this was by far one of the messiest strongholds I've ever seen. Everything was scattered, the paths were broken. Thankfully, the portal room wasn't that far away. Now, because we were far away from our factory, I could actually turn shaders on again. I placed a bed down, set my spawn, and mentally prepared for the journey that awaited us on the other side of the portal. With one small leap, we found ourselves standing on a small obsidian platform. Thankfully, we learned our lesson from the Better Minecraft video, and this time we brought pumpkins. With the help of my rending gale, I was able to zip over the void and onto the island. Now it was just a matter of taking out the crystals and killing the dragon. I let the crystals portion to Noah because he had a grappling hook and he had mastered the skill of traveling from building to building. Because he didn't have a rending gale, Noah had to bridge across. But once he finally got there, he jumped into action. Swinging from tower to tower, Noah destroyed each crystal. We stayed on the dragon, following him around, hoping that eventually he would land in the center. It was only a matter of time before he did just that, but not before unleashing a poison spray attack on us. With the dragon hovering over the portal, Noah and I began a relentless wave of attacks. In that moment, we were able to deal a huge chunk of damage. After multiple attacks, the dragon was finished. With that obstacle out of the way, it was time to move forward and find our new ingredient, which could be found in the Outer Islands. Before we continued, we took a moment to appreciate the dragon egg and the beauty of the shaders. After that, we set ourselves a little base and began to provoke Endermen. Traveling in the Outer Islands was very difficult without Ender Pearls, so we needed to stock up. It didn't take long before we had a mob of Endermen right at our doorstep. They were just walking right into our swords. By the end of this little mob grinding battle, we had more than enough Ender Pearls to begin our exploration. We scrambled to the floating portal. Now, I don't know why they designed it this way. I always thought it was way too much of a hassle to actually get up there, but I guess challenge was the thing in mind. Now, I took out my Ender Pearl and threw it in, and for some reason I just have this fear that every time I throw the pearl in, I'm probably gonna fall into the void somehow. Now that we were in the Outer Islands, it was only a matter of time before we found that one necessary crafting ingredient, that being a poise bush. Now don't worry, I will explain why we need the poise bush later. We ventured out into the island, and thankfully we didn't have to do a lot of island hopping before we came across the one biome where the poise bushes were growing. Unfortunately, I forgot my shears. Thankfully, Noah came well prepared, so he gathered as many as he could, and then we were on our way back, but not before exploring a little more. Noah came across this weird spider-like creature that when hit, bounced like a frog. As we were about to cross the portal, he was then assaulted by a pair of Endermen. Now the reason we got poise bushes was because we were going to be making a new ingot, and that ingot, well, it required the bushes. It also required melted silver, which we could make plenty of with our silver coins. And the final ingredient, ender powder. When combined together, you get a metal called endurium alloy. The only problem was that we had the wrong type of poise bush. Well, it was the right one, but it wasn't fully grown. We needed to make a phytogenic insulator, something that would make the plants grow way faster. To make that, we were gonna need lumium ingots. They're basically glowstone ingots. You have to melt down the glowstone and combine it with copper and silver. With our magma crucible, we were able to melt down some glowstone that Noah got from the nether. We took all the metals, mixed them up in the smeltery, and we were able to make our lumium. And like I said before, the phytogenic isolator basically speeds up the process, makes the plants grow faster. But we do have to keep a steady supply of water flowing in. By the end of this process, we had fully matured poise bushes. Now we could make our endurium. Now finally, everything that we've done led up to this moment, because we were making an ender tank. And what is an ender tank? It's basically like an ender chest, but for liquids. I crafted myself some ender casings with obsidian and an ender pearl. We combined the endurium with inductive mechanisms. This made an endurium mechanism, or an ender mechanism, one of the two. When you surround the ender casing with the mechanisms, you get an endurium machine, the foundation for all of the endurium blocks. With the help of a smithing table, we were able to combine the endurium machine with the fluid tank, and this gave us an ender tank. And believe it or not, this trouble that we went through, it was absolutely worth it for what was coming next. Now, like an ender chest, to get the most out of this block, you're obviously gonna need two of them, because the point of it is to access the same inventory from a completely different area. Now let's say we pump fluids into one of the ender tanks. If we're on the other side of the world and we want to access that same reserve of fluids, then all we have to do is open the ender tank on our end. And in this instance, we were going to be pumping oil. Now the nearest oil reserve is basically an ocean away, hence the reason we needed the ender tank. We weren't going to be going back and forth making multiple trips to scoop the oil one bucket at a time. So the best use of the ender tank was to take the oil, pump it in there, and then access it from the factory. I lowered a hose down into the bottom of the oil reserve. And with the help of wind power, we were able to keep this thing pumping 24/7. We had a steady flow of oil flowing into the ender tank. Now, the only question remained, was it going to show up on the other side? And wouldn't you know it, technology prevails again. Now it was time to refine the crude oil, because we needed rocket fuel, and oil at its basic form was not going to cut it. When you refine crude oil, you get one of two things. One of the products you may get from refining is called heavy oil. It's this red one here. As for the oil with an orange tint, this one is called light oil. As for the refining itself, to get the job done, we were going to need a block called a fractioning still. The materials that we had, we were able to easily put one together. All I had to do now was set up a system where we could pump the oil from the ender tank into the fractioning still, and then into some storage tanks. I ended up using a lot of pipes and a lot of fluid tank blocks. I installed some pumps and even applied some filters so that we could separate the heavy oil from the light oil. And last but not least, the ender tank. We were going to be pumping oil from our ender tank straight into our refining system. I also had to expand the windmill a little because it wasn't turning anymore with all these new additions. With all the pumps up and running, it was time to see if the system actually worked. Oil was going into the fractioning still, and it looked like the machine was actually refining it. And as you can see, just from crude oil, we would get heavy fuel and light fuel. Both variations of the fuel were then pumped into different directions. On the right we had our light fuel, and on the left side we had our heavy fuel. Every once in a while, the pumps would send bursts of either fuel into their respective tanks. There they would be stored until their second refining process. Once they were powered up, we then had the oils pumped into the next fractioning still, where they would be refined into the final product, rocket fuel. The rocket fuel was then transported to a final storage tank where it sat there until we needed to use it for our rocket ships. Our oxygen system and our rocket fuel system all in one section, ready to be used for our new ships. At long last, it was time to make the rocket itself. One of the first blocks we were going to need were the thrusters. This was going to give us lift when we were launching. To make this block, we had to make some blaze burners. Then, I went to the nether and began my journey to our new blaze farm. I had never collected blazes with blaze burners before. I usually left that to Noah, so this was going to be a first for me. I stopped and thought about the best way to approach this without getting burnt to a crisp. In the end, I did just decide to go for it, and yeah, I did burn. The blaze burners in hand, I then combined them with plastic to make our thrusters. It was pretty much the same process to make the rocket's fuel tanks. And to make the actual seat of the rocket, we just had to make a seat itself and then combine it with plastic. We had all the pieces to build our rockets. Now, it was just a matter of figuring out how we were actually going to fuel the thing. Thankfully, the mod pack did include a way to do that, and the best part was that we didn't even have to use any pipes. I gathered some materials to craft some of the last remaining items that was keeping us from going to space. One of the items we needed was called a rocket linking device. Next, I ran over to the mechanical crafter to make our next necessary item. This next block was called a rocket fueling station. Now that we had the linking device and the rocket fueling station, there was only one last thing left for us to do, and that was to craft the final block that would make our rocket ship endeavor possible. I went back to the calculator wing and gathered all the computation matrices we had created. Now, in order to make this crafting recipe work, we were gonna need to upgrade our mechanical crafter. So, we made the biggest crafting grid we had ever used. And I'm not kidding when I say that this next crafting recipe is massive. It required tons of plastic ingots, most of them on the corners. And then in the center, we needed to apply our 8 computation matrices. It was then a matter of just watching all of the pieces come together. At the end of the line, they form one of the most expensive blocks in this mod pack. This was the rocket guidance computer. We had all the pieces we needed to build our rocket. It was finally time to begin assembling it. First things first, without a proper launch pad, this rocket wasn't going anywhere. I then began to lay out the thrusters and started building the rocket up piece by piece. Beside the rocket, I also had to build the launch tower. Thankfully, the tower itself didn't have to be that tall. With the launch pad complete and the rocket fully assembled, all that was left to do was to scan the ship. Finally, everything that we've worked on for the past 400 days was finally coming together. It was time to look at the rocket specs. Before we could launch, everything had to be in order, especially the fuel. After scanning the rocket, we could actually see how much power it had, how much it weighed, and how fast it could accelerate. I began to fill up some buckets so that we could begin the fueling process. Once I loaded the fuel into the fueling station, it was then a matter of getting enough oxygen tanks to make sure that we wouldn't suffocate up there. I also filled some extra buckets of fuel to take with me, because I was warned by the subscribers that I only had enough fuel for one trip. I had no intention of getting stuck on the moon, so we were gonna do this right. I almost forgot to craft planet ID chips. Basically, they're these little microchips that you put into the rocket, and then they tell the ship where to go. And this was just a fun little thing I wanted to do after. If we were gonna go on the moon, then of course we had to plant a flag. Everything was set. My shulker box had plenty of extra fuel, including all the materials we needed to build an extra launch pad, just in case something went wrong. We were set to launch in the morning. Unfortunately, the rocket could only seat one, so Noah was stuck building his rocket last minute. It was finally launch day, and thanks to our fueling station and our rocket linking device, we were able to wirelessly fuel our rocket ship. It was time for the final countdown. Everything that we've done, this is what it was for. In a few seconds, we were going to be launching to the moon. And just like that, we had liftoff. Sitting inside of the rocket ship, there were 3 things you could actually see. The first being how much fuel you had, the second being how much velocity, and the last one showing your elevation. Within a matter of seconds, we were hundreds of blocks off the ground. It didn't take long before we began descending on what looked like the surface of the moon. Although the sky did look a little weird. This was a very shaky landing, but thankfully the rocket didn't explode. After a quick descent, we made a safe touchdown. Honestly, I expected the sky to be a little darker. Maybe it was our shaders, but we were on the moon, so who's complaining? As for the moon itself, well, there wasn't a lot going on here. It was in this moment that I realized I made a terrible mistake. I forgot to bring my shulker box. This was a bittersweet moment because yes, we were on the moon, yes, I planted my flag, but unless Noah got here, I was gonna die. What's even worse was that Noah was having problems with his rocket. It wouldn't launch, it was glitched for some reason. It was day 400 and I was stuck on the moon. Was this gonna be the end of our industrial ambitions? Did I actually fly too close to the sun? I didn't know how long it was gonna take for Noah to get me, so until then, I was just gonna have to make myself comfortable. It may take 1 day, it may take 10 days, heck, it may even take another 100 days, but I had no intent on dying here. Of all our first days, this one was the most important. If I was going to be rescued from the moon, then Noah needed to act quickly because I was running out of oxygen. Driven by the hope to save his friend, Noah was determined to see that everything would go according to plan. He would be quick, he would be crafty, but above all else, he would remember to bring the shulker box. It was all on him. If we were going to complete these 500 days, then he had to succeed. But you know what? I had full faith in the guy. If anyone could get this job done correctly, it was Noah. I just really hope he remembers to bring extra rocket fuel. Eventually, I could see what resembled a rocket descending from the sky. After being stranded in space, at last, I was reunited with my friend. And unlike me, Noah actually brought the shulker box. The first thing he did was place the gas pad down, because I was in desperate need of some oxygen. My pickaxe was also low on durability, so Noah gave me some manual ingots and an anvil to repair it. He really came through, because he also brought all the necessary blocks to actually build the rocket pad, that way we could return to Earth whenever we wanted. Now our main goal on the moon was to colonize it. We wanted to establish something of a civilization, so the first task at hand was building a shelter. Out in the middle of nowhere, resources were extremely limited. The only thing we had to build was whatever Noah had in his inventory at the time. Glass and some type of cobblestone. Now this structure was extremely basic. Far more basic than what we usually build, but it by no means represents anything we're gonna strive for on this moon. We're gonna go for grand, we're gonna go for monolithic, we're gonna go for something eternal. But you can't get very far on the moon without oxygen. After we constructed our basic building, the next task was to fill it up with air. The only way to do this was with a block called an oxygen vent. Thankfully, Noah had excellent foresight and brought one with him before he came to the moon. The oxygen vent works similarly to the gas charge pad in the sense that you could put tanks of oxygen and it would fill up. The question was, how were we going to vent the air back out? In our first attempt, we put an energy block underneath the vent, thinking that as soon as we had the energy flowing, the block would automatically turn on. That wasn't the case. After that, we were pretty stumped, until we had the genius idea of actually putting a lever on it and switching it on. And guess what? That's all we had to do. Okay, now we had a way of actually getting oxygen into the room. The room had to be 100% sealed at all times. If you opened a door, if you broke a block, then all of the air would be sucked out and you would suffocate. Well, if we couldn't open any doors, then how are we supposed to get outside? Introducing the airlock. Now the concept of an airlock is pretty simple. You have two doors and a hallway in between. For example, let's say we want to go outside. All I have to do is open up the door, but the air is not being sucked out because we have a second door at the end of the hallway. Now as soon as I step into the hallway leaving the space station, the door behind me closes. Now at this point, I should have my spacesuit on because the door behind me is closed, cutting me off from the main source of oxygen. You see how the torch isn't burning? Well, that's because torches can't burn without air, so that's one good way to test if there's actually air in your room. I can now open up the second door and step outside without having to worry about the building losing its oxygen, and that's basically all there is to it. The point of an airlock is to keep the air locked in. We had completed 2 little mini projects, but we were just getting started. If we were going to do anything else, then I had to make a quick trip back to Earth because there were tons of supplies that we needed. It felt amazing to be back on Earth. There was plenty of fresh air, plus all my stuff was there. I went to the money factory and gathered as many silver coins as I could. There were a ton of things to gather before going back to the moon. I swapped the silver for gold, because with the gold, we were going to be buying shulker boxes. We were going to need a ton of storage, because we weren't planning on making too many trips back and forth from the Earth to the moon. Now the basic idea was that I was going to stack my ender chest full of shulker boxes, all of which contained everything we needed for our moon plans. With all the blocks I needed, I returned to the moon and began Phase 2, oxygen production. We needed to make as much breathable air as possible. To be honest, the design for this oxygen machine was pretty easy. I just based it off of the one machine we had back on Earth. At the end of the day, all we needed was 2 holding tanks, a blaze burner, and a basin to mix the zinc and copper sheets. The whole thing was powered with a windmill bearing, which is kinda weird considering that there's no oxygen on the surface of the moon. Now for this to be effective, the blaze burner always has to be burning, so we had a steady supply of coke blocks funneling in. After that, everything worked like a charm. The mixer was mixing the sheets, and it was making oxygen and hydrogen. Eventually, we were going to run out of coke blocks, and we needed a way to keep the blaze burner constantly fueled, so it was time to make a tree farm. I added a second oxygen machine next to the tree farm because the saplings can't grow without air. This is where things got a little tricky because it's very difficult to fill a space like this with air. The tree farm was a fail. I decided to take a little break from my oxygen endeavors. Instead, I focused my attention towards building the space base. In order to build this as quickly as possible, I decided to split the base into 3 sections. Using my schematics, I then determined the best possible place to put the base. Thank God the Create mod offers a preview, because at least you have an idea of what it's going to look like. What followed was one of the longest building sequences we have ever done on this mod. There were 3 cannons, all firing blocks at the same time, with one goal: to build up this massive space base that took me 1 week to design. To be honest, there really wasn't a lot to do on the moon aside from building the space base, so I spent a good chunk of my time on standby making sure that the cannons had all the blocks they needed. Every once in a while, I'd go inside and tour the partially constructed building just to see that everything was coming along nicely. I decided to step away from the space base, let the cannons do their thing. We were gonna need lots of air still because if we weren't gonna be pumping the air, we still needed the oxygen tanks to refill our spacesuits. I ended up building this massive multi-mixing oxygen machine. Don't let its complicated looking design overwhelm you. Essentially, I just built multiple oxygen machines and connected them all together. We had multiple mixers, multiple basins, and a lot of blaze burners that needed to be fueled. When powered on, this machine would produce more oxygen than we could inhale in a lifetime. But such a machine needs a lot of fuel. These blaze burners needed to be burning at all times. There were no trees, which meant that using logs was going to be difficult, especially since we couldn't grow them, so we decided to look down. Right underneath our feet was one of the best fuel sources for blaze burners. I'm referring to lava. And there was a lot of lava down there. It was simply a matter of how we were going to get the lava from the bottom of the cave into the blaze burners. Well, the first step was actually bringing it up to the surface. We would use a hose pulley to do that. The next step was designing a means of distributing it evenly amongst the blaze burners. We would accomplish this with buckets that would get filled with lava every time they passed a spout. The buckets would then circle around the conveyor belt, entering a funnel which was connected to a deployer. The deployer would then take the lava bucket, pour it into the blaze burner, and then it would drop the bucket back on the conveyor belt, where it would circle around and get filled with lava again. At last, we finally had automated oxygen, which was a massive breakthrough considering that we were on the moon. Meanwhile, the schematic cannons were hard at work. Our tower was finally beginning to rise from the ground. Day after day, night after night, blocks were being placed 24 hours, 7 days a week. It was only a matter of time before our space base would finally be complete. At last, we had finally reached the pinnacle of cubic creation, a stellar structure amongst the stars. The tower casted an imposing shadow over everything we had built. Its grand interiors had plenty of space to build anything our hearts desired. And don't even get me started on the views. This place was magnificent. The space tower would act as our new headquarters. From here on out, all of our future projects would begin here, inside of the building. I mean, hey, we did have the room for it. I decided to take a little tour around the tower, and I was very happy that I decided to make the rooms extra big, because jumping around with little to no gravity, well, you're gonna be bumping your head on the ceiling. Thankfully here, that wasn't the case. I even outfitted the tower with working elevators. Now that I actually had a chance to walk around and explore the interior, I was beginning to question whether or not the tower was too big. I mean, there was no chance we were gonna fill this whole thing with oxygen. Whichever window you looked out of, there wasn't a bad view. You could see for miles the barren wasteland that was the surface of the moon. My favorite room was this grand reception area. It had a giant window that peered out into the stars. On the lower level was a second elevator. That's the one Noah took to meet up with me because he had yet to explore the interior. But wait, there's more. There was a third elevator, and this one was a special elevator. It provided access to the highest point of the space tower. It was here in this grand observation room where Noah and I would live. We were going to make this our new home. There was more than enough space for both of us, and just for fun, I even decided to make a little throne room. In the end, it finally felt good to sit in my own chair and just admire everything that we had done. Our next goal was to convert the tower into a functioning factory. So Noah and I decided to reconfigure our rocket ship. Instead of making 2 trips with 2 different rockets, Noah and I were just going to make one big rocket that we could ride together. We admired the tower one last time before returning to Earth. Our ambitions were without limits. Now, some might consider that a bad thing, but at this point, Noah and I, we were kings of industry. It would take an act of God to stop us now. We entered the rocket, gazing upon our crown jewel during liftoff. Little did we know that that was the last time we'd see it. You see, all it takes is a single mistake. Just one for life to come crashing down. The lesson of the day: always watch your step. All of it. Gone. Just like that. One misstep. That's all it took to reduce the entire city to rubble. The clock tower, the berry farm, every single factory that we had worked on. Nothing more than a husk of their former selves. To make things worse, our bed was broken. So Noah and I had to travel some weird distance. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was because we just came from the moon. But it took way longer to get back than it usually should have. When we got there, it was surprising to see that almost everything was beyond recovery. And Robert, well, he was nowhere to be seen. Now usually I would have guessed that he hacked or something to get all that TNT, but with the Create stuff that we left behind, it wasn't that difficult to mass produce gunpowder. I mean, we already had a machine that could do that. He was obviously still on the server because we could see that he was still online. I swam to his corpse to check the inventory, when all of a sudden, I heard a rumbling, a familiar rumbling that could only belong to one thing. By the time I got back to shore, I saw a rocket leaving the world. And the rocket's pilot? Take a wild guess. I know he didn't have the resources to build that, so obviously he stole the rocket that we came in. Not to mention the spacesuit he was wearing, so he obviously looted our corpses. We were stuck on the Earth with no way to get to him. Well, we're back to square one. But you know what? This is probably good for us. Everybody needs a fresh start once in a while. If we were gonna have our revenge, we needed to invent things Robert didn't know about. He knew about everything in Create Above and Beyond, but not in Create Astral. So I migrated the world over. We needed a humble pickaxe at... What? This was gonna be a problem. On top of losing everything, we had to relearn it all as well. I wasn't gonna live in the ruins of our old city. He knew where we lived, and I couldn't take a chance of losing it all again. So we had to relocate. We had officially fallen from technological grace and entered a new dark age. Thankfully, we were still masters of Tinker's Construct, so we could find a way to work around that weird crafting recipe that didn't want to give us our pickaxe. I put together the most primitive tool you could make with this mod, a wooden pickaxe. I finally had a tool, which meant I could finally get to work. And as soon as I gathered that cobblestone, I instantly swapped out the pickaxe for a better one. We had a lot of catching up to do, which meant that we needed to get as many resources as we possibly could. We needed tin, we needed copper, we needed iron, anything that could be melted down and molded into a machine, we needed it. With the few resources that I had, I packed my things and I moved on. I was not going to live in a snow biome. One of the more interesting things I came across were these wolves that were natural-born inventors. Look at their little goggles. Another day was coming to a close, but I did find myself a spot. It was here in the spruce forest that we would establish a new period of progress. And like many of our great projects of the past, I began chopping down as many trees as I possibly could. I laid the foundation of our new settlement atop a hill. While it was certainly no palace of progress like the one in our industrial paradise, this little log cabin would have to do. And you know what? I'm perfectly fine with that. This cabin was pretty cozy after all. I completed the cabin. Then all of a sudden, Noah emerged from the tree line. This was the first time I had seen him since the fallout. Who would have thought that we needed to reunite twice in this video? I went back to work and discovered that nothing in this mod is what I thought it was. I didn't even know how to craft a furnace. Our first task was to gather the essential materials. To get a simple workshop started, we were going to need clay and andesite. We also needed some tin and copper to make some of our first machines. In this mod pack, copper is king. Not only can it be used for tools, but it can also be used for weapons. Like the one being used by my skeletal friend who tried to do away with me. Noah came back from a little expedition, and he brought back some interesting items, including some much-needed andesite, as well as a strange-looking block. Some type of machine that I had never seen before. One of the many benefits of copper, which I wish they had in vanilla, was that you could actually use it to make armor. Not only that, but you could also use it to make tools. Now at this point, Noah and I were finally somewhat geared up, but we still didn't have any proper weapons. At least that was the case until I stole this thing from a skeleton. I then went to go show Noah what I had discovered. Now the next problem to tackle early on was the matter of storage. There was a type of sorting system called a storage unit. We could also craft these boxes known as packages, and like a regular chest, you could store stuff in them, but when you broke them, they retained their inventory, kinda like a shulker box. The only downside was that there was only one inventory slot in each package, which means you had to dedicate an entire box to one item. The final task of our introduction to this new mod pack was to create an andesite compound. Clay nuggets and andesite, that's what you needed. Then you took the compound, put it in a furnace, and boom, andesite alloys. Much easier than the entire factory we dedicated to making the one item. The next task was to create bronze. All we had to do was mix copper and tin on a smithing table, and then we took the bronze, put it in a stone cutter, and made bronze sheets. We needed it to make cogwheels, and above and beyond, they were made out of wood, so the fact that they're now made out of bronze means that they are way more expensive to make, and all the more precious to have. But I will give them this, they look much better than they did before. As for the andesite casing, all we had to do was take our alloy and right-click a log, and boom, instant andesite casing. It was time to do a scientific speedrun, but before we went any further with our machines, we needed to make our weapons. If we were gonna take back our industrial paradise, then we needed the means to do so. With that out of the way, it was time to quickly put together a workshop. Only this time, it wouldn't take us nearly as long, because now we knew what we were doing. The only thing that took some getting used to were the new crafting recipes, but aside from that, we were literally able to breeze through this. What once took us a week to do on our first playthrough of Create, now only took a single day. We had every tool we needed to build up our industrial paradise once more. The only thing that we were missing was our beautiful block, andesite. For a third time, we had to recycle Noah's wonderful andesite generator machine. We dug to the bedrock level, installed some drills, we even set up some redstone. But for this design to work, we were gonna need a conveyor belt, which meant we also needed rubber. Thankfully, there were rubber trees, but that wasn't enough. The rubber itself had to be combined with cooked kelp. Before you make rubber, you're gonna need sap. And to get sap, you have to put rubber logs in a millstone. The next step was to go out to the ocean and collect some kelp. Once you have the kelp, all you have to do next is cook it up. Now that you have your cooked kelp, the next step is to actually turn the sap into rubber. You can do this by putting it into a basin and having it mixed up with a mixer. The final step for making the mechanical belt is to take the kelp, take the rubber, combine them all on a crafting table, and there you have it! I installed the belt on the andesite generator. What followed was a long and tedious process of fixing up this redstone. I'm not very good at it. It would generate andesite, diorite, sometimes even granite. After that, I spent some time going to a desert looking for a cactus. We needed the cactus for the green dye because we were gonna make glue. Meanwhile, Noah was hard at work planting his crops. When I got home, I began prepping a new work site. While I had been away getting the cactus, the andesite generator was doing its thing. It produced tons of andesite which you could actually combine and compress into a new type of block. Our goal was to make triple compressed andesite. You see, in a regular cobblestone generator, the lava and the water they touch, and they make cobblestone. But for the one that we were using, the lava and water, they're meeting over bedrock, which means they can not only make cobblestone, but also granite, diorite, and andesite. The only problem is that the chances of andesite spawning are pretty low. But we can increase those chances to 100% if the lava and the water meet over triple compressed andesite. Now you're probably wondering what that big contraption was. That was our andesite alloy machine. And one of the next steps to completing it was by adding some Tinker's Construct blocks. We put together some grout, cooked it up, and made some seared bricks. Because we made so many grout blocks, we were awarded a ton of items, including a sniffer egg. Now, I'm not entirely sure what this mob does, but at least we had one, so it went into Noah's animal pen. Now, by this point, we had unlocked the second chapter, which meant that things were gonna get a little more complicated. Thankfully, we had already accomplished some of the goals, like making a small tinker setup and creating triple compressed andesite. When I collected the block to get the achievement, I was awarded 8 blocks of andesite alloy. We had the seared bricks, which meant it was time to make a puny smelter. I looked at the recipes and saw that we had everything we needed. I took the copper, smashed it into sheets, and then I prepared the seared bricks to be mixed with the sap. This would create the brick blocks. Now, I don't know why we needed sap for this recipe, but I'm guessing that it acts as some type of glue, some type of binding to bring the bricks together. Once we had our brick blocks, putting together the small smeltery setup was pretty simple. I worked through a rainy night to ensure that the small smeltery was going to be complete. We needed to wrap up our andesite alloy machine quickly. Now you're probably wondering why we needed the setup to begin with. Well, we needed to melt down the gold. Why? Well, we needed a gold ingot cast. You see, the cast was like the last missing piece of the puzzle for this machine to run properly. All we needed now was a means to power it. Once again, we were going to look to wind power. In these early stages, wind power can't be beat. I put together the windmill bearing, and while I usually would use wool for the blades, I was going to have to make sails if I wanted the achievement. Thankfully, Noah had been breeding plenty of sheep, so that wasn't going to be a problem. I crafted the sails, and then I began placing the cogs to make sure that everything would be connected and running in sync. With the help of some gearboxes and mechanical belts, this complicated machine was finally put together. The blades installed and the windmill running, the machine was now producing andesite alloys at a steady rate. Here's how it works. To make andesite alloy, you need an andesite compound, and for that you need andesite, iron nuggets, and clay. The first issue to tackle was making andesite. Do you remember the triple compressed andesite block? Well, it was doing its job. Lava and water were touching over the block, and they were producing andesite with a 100% success rate. A fan would then blow the andesite block into the hopper, where the andesite would then be moved into a storage unit. Next was the issue of tackling clay. For this process, we only needed a regular cobblestone generator. The block would be broken by a drill, and then it would be funneled down a chute into a millstone. The millstone would grind the cobblestone up and turn it into gravel. The gravel then passed through a storage unit, which acted like a hopper. In the second millstone, the gravel would then be ground up into sand. The sand would then pass through a second storage unit and onto a depot. There, the sand would be washed by a mechanical fan until it was converted into clay. It would go down into the last storage unit, where it would be stored with the rest of the clay balls. The last and final item we needed was iron nuggets, and that began with a third cobblestone generator. The cobblestone would be broken and fall into a millstone. It would be ground up into gravel. The gravel was then moved to a depot, where it would be washed by a fan. When you wash gravel, you get one of two things, either an iron nugget or flint. We had the andesite, we had the clay, and now we had the nuggets. The last and final step was combining the three in a basin using a mixer. The mixer would automatically activate, mix it all up, and pour it down into the gold cast we had made. Once the andesite alloy had solidified, it was then deposited into a crude storage unit down below. There you go, automated andesite alloy. A complicated machine, but I am grateful to the YouTuber who designed it. The next step was more of a cosmetic choice, but it did serve a practical function. We needed to conceal the entire machine because it looked ugly. I began with the cobblestone base and surrounded the whole thing in one wooden box. I then connected this new building with the bridge that was attached to our first cabin. The bridge now connecting both of our buildings, I could take a quick shortcut to see the new factory. The only problem was that I couldn't build a roof. The windmill was just too big. Before I demolished the windmill, I began placing stairs to act as the frame for the roof. Once I couldn't build any further, the windmill came down. What followed was a fun little building session. I wanted this place to feel like home, so I took the windmill blades and I fashioned them to resemble our old windmill back in the industrial paradise. Now resources were running low, and remember, copper is king, so what if you could automate it? Well, you could. And to do that, we needed a block called Viridium. To make it, you just needed to pour lava over seared stone. But to make seared stone, you needed to pour molten clay over regular stone. So once again, it was time to rig up a bunch of millstones because we were going to be grounding cobblestone into gravel to make clay. When you ground gravel up, you make sand, and when you wash sand, you get clay. So it was time to begin this long process. I just copied what we had done on the andesite alloy machine. I connected the new machine to the already running windmill. That way, the andesite alloy machine and the Viridium machine could run on the same power source. Everything was coming together. The only thing I underestimated were the number of millstones I was going to need. At the beginning, I started with a simple pair of millstones, but we were going to need way more. Once everything was connected, the last thing I needed to do was install some cobblestone generators. With cobblestone being produced, I added a trio of drills. That was the last thing we needed because the clay machine was now complete. It was time to move on to phase 2. We were going to build a really big smeltery because I intended on producing a ton of clay. To make the smeltery, we first needed to dig underneath the clay machine. The setup would be comprised of multiple storage units, the smeltery itself, and a series of mechanical belts. So we really needed the space. The seared stone machine was finally complete. It began in the first section, where cobblestone was being drilled and ground up into sand. Like the other machine, the sand would head down into a depot where it would be washed and converted into clay. The clay then ended up in a storage unit where it would move down into a conveyor belt. The belt would move the items down into the smeltery where they would be melted into molten clay. Phase 2 began in a second cobblestone generator. Stone would be drilled, and then it would move down to a furnace fan that we had installed, searing it into regular stone. Our stone blocks would then move into a series of storage units where they would be held. The storage units would then move them into a basin, which would automatically pour onto them the molten clay. With the stone and clay combined, we had finally produced seared stone. It was time to move on to phase 2, Viridium production. And for that, we were gonna need lava. wanted to automate lava like we had done in the previous world. To do this, we needed to reinvent pumps and pipes and anything that was used for handling fluids. All the more reason to automate copper because these recipes were expensive. I flattened down what little copper we had left to make our pipes. I then used the rest of the materials to produce our pumps and our storage tanks. It was really good to recover some lost technology because at this point I was feeling very limited. The last and final essential item was the hose pulley. To make it, we needed copper casing, and for that, we needed an assembly line we didn't even have. So I put together a makeshift assembly line. All we needed were 2 deployers, some rubber, and some copper. I then took a regular andesite casing and ran it through the line 3 times until we finally had our copper casing. With that out of the way, I was able to craft the hose pulley, the beautiful block that we had used multiple times for our last infinite lava source. Now the goal was to pump lava from the nether, but to make a nether portal you need diamonds to break the obsidian. So I went down into the caves to begin a mining expedition. You needed a mechanical drill to break diamonds. An iron pickaxe wouldn't work, it had to be a drill. Once I had collected my diamonds, I began to ward off an army of hostile mobs. Thankfully, I was armed. Now I did leave some diamonds behind because there was a way to apply fortune on your tool with tinkers. But to do this we needed a tinker's anvil. Thankfully I had some bronze lying around, and while it was a little expensive, I think this was a pretty important investment. With the tinker's anvil crafted, it was time to make a new pickaxe, one with the capability to turn one diamond into many. I began by making all the necessary casts to pour the metals into. Once I had all the parts I needed, made of iron of course, I then combined them in the tinker's anvil to make my base item. Now in tinkers, the fortune effect is actually called luck. And to apply it, you need to surround your tool with multiple lapis blocks, as well as blue dye, at least for the first level of luck. I then applied the diamond to ensure that we could mine tougher ores. With my 1 level of luck, I went back down to the same vein of diamonds and mined the rest. And just because I had luck on my pickaxe, I was able to double the amount of diamonds I originally would have gotten. I then went to go mine some obsidian for our lava machine. I built the portal, lit it up, and I stepped inside, only to discover something that I had no idea would be a problem. Yeah, in this mod pack, there is no nether, so that was a big waste of time, but we did have a plan B. I went to a geode to mine some calcite, and with the calcite I combined it with water to create dripstone blocks. I then crafted some cauldrons, and I was gonna put it all together because instead of pumping lava, we were gonna generate it. I began clearing the stone where the portal once stood. I placed down the cauldrons and began making a channel for the lava to flow through. Now for those of you who don't know, you can actually generate lava with dripstones. All you have to do is have a lava source block right above a dripstone block. After that, the dripstone will start dripping lava into the cauldron. It's only a matter of time before the cauldron gets full, and after that, all we need to do is pump the lava out. Inside of the same cave, I built some fluid tanks. I then decided to connect the fluid tank to the smeltery. That way that thing could constantly keep melting clay. By the time I had figured out how to set everything up and connect all the pipes to all the machines, the cauldrons had filled up. The final task was to get the pipes up and running. Eventually lava started pumping into the tanks from the cauldrons, and from the tank it went into the smeltery. Though I did want to produce more lava, so I built a second setup right next to the original. But what about the viridium? Well, we were gonna need lava for that too. I then began clearing a second cave to build another smeltery. It would be here where we'd finally produce our viridium, the source of our infinite copper. In this smeltery, we would pump it full of lava. After that, I began experimenting with a ton of crude storage units as a means of transferring our seared stone. The stone would travel from one smeltery to another. Once it arrived at its location, the seared stone would then be inputted into the casting basin. Lava would be poured over the stone, and this would cause a reaction converting it into viridium. Now that we had a source of this green block, we were one step closer to infinite copper. I took the little viridium that we had generated and I went back to our first little workshop. There I threw the viridium into the millstone where it would be grounded up. Once broken down, the millstone would spit out a nice piece of copper. To finalize everything, I took the crushed copper, put it into the fire, and watched it smelt into a beautiful copper ingot. We were running out of time, so I decided to spend my last few days working on a project that was relatively simple, yet extremely essential. I began by building a stone brick foundation for what would be a raised platform. I then filled the center with dirt. Reason being was because we were gonna make a tree farm. You know what? You can never go wrong with tree farms. I'm not gonna lie. I was really missing the automation of simple blocks such as wood and cobblestone, so I was trying to get back everything that we had lost, including the tree farm. At the end of our 100 days, there was really a lot to reflect on. I mean, we had accomplished so much and lost it all so quickly. We may have experienced a temporary setback, but remember, progress never stops. Now don't worry, we're not going to abandon the city. I have plans to go back. Although there is one thing I am wondering. What's Robert doing on the moon? Because honestly, unless he took supplies with him, he's not going to find much. Unless, of course, he does happen to stumble across our space base, but you know what? What are the chances of that happening, right? Right? If we were gonna have our revenge, then we needed to work hard. At this point, there wasn't a moment to lose. If he wants to squat in the space base, he can have it. But it's a pretty cool base. So if you want to see us take it back from the clutches of Robert, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe for 600 days, because ladies and gentlemen, a war is about to begin. I don't know how we're gonna do it, but I promise you that in the end, we're gonna come out on top. I will see you in the next one, hopefully in a better state of mind. This has been Doublesal. Thanks for watching.